All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are live. Welcome to MythVision Podcast. We are MythVision. Today, we're going to have a discussion slash debate. They will disagree on the topic, and it'll be wonderful to listen to two men that I have found to be very cordial from both sides of the street to have a conversation on whether Jesus rose from the dead or not, and how they assess this information, their epistemology, just the idea of how they're approaching this, having an actual friendly conversation, but disagreeing on points. So you guys don't want to miss this. This will be a very interesting show. I really, really think you want to stick around. Don't forget to like that video, if you will. Drop some comments. Let us know if you like it, you don't like it, you agree, you disagree, etc. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Now to our intro. I swear I do not worship them. I'm just somebody who looks up to them. Okay, I worship him a little bit, okay? Don't judge me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do like the book of Acts, and I'm going to make Paul Peter and Peter Paul just jokingly here. We have a Christian named Jonathan MS Pearce and an atheist, Caleb Jackson. Welcome to the channel. I'm teasing. Definitely teasing. Welcome to the channel, guys. Thank you for coming and I guess getting in the gladiator ring to sip tea together and have a conversation.
Absolutely. I look forward to this. Thank you for hosting, Derek. I'm sure it's going to be awesome.
Oh, it's definitely going to be great. Caleb, we've talked before on a live, like the way that you are. I mean, at the end of the day, I can't knock you too much, man. We're all going to go to heaven one day, okay, according to your ideas. So this is something very pretty. And then according to Pierce, we're all going to go to sleep the same way we were before we were born. And at the end of the day, I think we both have a happy ending in some way, shape, or form. So
mine is actually a neutral ending. It's neither happy nor sad. It just kind of is.
I think complete rest from the struggle of life, it sounds pretty happy to me, especially as difficult as things have been for me in my life. And I'm sure a lot of people would relate. But we're going to talk about this guy named Jesus, who has literally been a game changer in the West, and the world has seen this myth, if you will, I call it a myth, really radically change a lot of people's lives throughout history, for the good, the bad, the ugly, all of that. But we're going to be delving into the sources, and can we trust that this man actually rose from the dead? These are the topics at hand today. I will be hanging out with you guys, trying not to interfere. If people want to super chat questions, I might poke and prod throughout the way as long as they're relevant. If not, I'll save them for Q&A at the end from our audience, and you guys can engage that way. Ready to go. Thank you for the super chat, Troy Miller. I appreciate it. Real quick, before we start, everybody go subscribe to the Tippling Philosopher. That is Jonathan MS Pearce YouTube channel. He's got lots of videos, and he is the skeptic today. He's the atheist who is approaching this. We also have Caleb Jackson, and I was like, what's your YouTube channel? He said, I co-host this channel. So go check him out. Make sure you guys subscribe, show him some love, and show that interfaith dialogue is possible, because that's what we're trying to accomplish here. You don't have to agree with everything, but get involved in the discussion. This is how we create unity even when we disagree. That's what I'm looking for. All right. Amazon, Jonathan MS Pearce has many, many books. He also has another one right now. I don't think it's hit Amazon yet. You have a yellow cover. It's one that looks like the red here, the Metamorphosis.
Oh, yeah. It's a sequel to that. Fine, prescient case, prescient bit of fiction about a pandemic, except in this present pandemic, people aren't eating other people's faces off, but they do in that one. So, you know.
Lots of good fun books. We're going to get into the nativity later on. And then we have Caleb Jackson, who has a book Undead, a historical investigation into the most famous miracle in history, which we're going to discuss today, the resurrection of Christ, Caleb Jackson. Now, I must warn everybody, I have a Patreon. You guys, please help support us. Tons of videos. I just dropped these 2 this morning. I mean, like, I'm constantly working, chipping away. And I mean, it goes on. And most of these have not seen the face of YouTube. And it goes like you literally can keep going. All right. It's literally the everlasting.
Derek, can you go back to Caleb's book?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just interested in the way that Amazon's shown his title, whether Caleb is saying that he is the Christ. Like, that's pretty presumptuous, and this could be difficult. If I'm arguing against Jesus, this could be quite.
I think it's a bit heretical. That's the series name.
Fair enough.
I appreciate the humor of it.
Seriously, thank you guys. Aryan, thank you so much for the super chat. Sunday tithing to Pastor Derek. Well, thank you, my friend. I don't know about my flock. My flock's pretty wild and all over the place. We're wild beast. Should we start with you, Caleb? I think it's important you're going on the side that this is true. And I think it's important to ask you, why do you think that Jesus rose from the dead, I guess? This is the age-old question. It's been asked 1,000 million billion times. But we need to start with you, I feel.
Yeah, typically in this kind of discussion, the affirmative would go first, so I think that's okay. Now, I mean, Derek has said this, and I think all of us here have clarified that this is not technically a debate as far as we didn't have an opening prepped to that degree. So we're kind of just presenting our cases and just building off of each other. So that's good. So just to give a short version, I guess the case I would make for the resurrection in this discussion would be 3 points. First, I would talk about the prior. So that would be about theism. And I don't want to, this isn't going to be a whole debate on the existence of God, but Jonathan actually does touch on some of these in his book. He mentions the Trinity and the incarnation and the atonement. And I actually think that's good, because if you're going to attack Christianity, I think those are good areas to start. Now, I don't think that he necessarily goes into depth as far as actually refuting those. He does list them. But I do think that if there were philosophical arguments, for example, that God would be triune or at least multi-personal, which you hear arguments from people like Leflau and Swinburne on that. And then you can give arguments for why a God would want to atone for sins and why that is perhaps the best option out of the options he has given humanity's sin. And I think when you look at that and then compare that to Jesus, that is when it starts becoming initially slightly more probable. Then the second tier would be, of course, the historical evidence, which is, I think, what most of us have written on, both in Jonathan's book and mine, which is when you get into things like when people bring up a gospel reliability, or some people take more of a minimal facts approach, like Gary Habermas, or more of what I call a moderate facts approach, which is kind of what I took, which is more Bill Craig style of like majority opinion facts, not necessarily consensus, and getting to there. Or you could take N.T. Wright's approach, which I also like, of working backwards from the resurrection belief. So I think from that, I would say that the resurrection of Christ is something that can be warranted historically. I think historical evidence alone, it's difficult to prove it, or at least say it's extremely probable. But at least I think we can say that, at least I would be of the opinion that, given the historical data and given one's philosophical back view, that the resurrection is warranted and has the best explanatory power out of the competing hypotheses. And the third tier I would point about that I don't think gets as nearly enough discussion is the approach I'm taking in the new book that I'm working on, which I call like the Recruitus approach. Recruitus being something that continues on today, that doesn't cease. So I think if Jesus rose from the dead, it wouldn't just be an event that happened in history. Yes, it did happen in history, at least that I'm arguing, but it's something that should continue to happen. If Jesus is still alive, we should expect to see certain things. And so we have to look at, what does the data look like if Jesus was still dead? And what would the data look like if Jesus is still alive and acting in the world? And that's where I would appeal to modern Christian miracles, visions of Jesus, etc. And I think when that gets added on to the probability of the other two factors, it dramatically increases the probability. So it is those three tiers that I would talk about. I know that the second tier probably is the one that most of us had the most familiarity with, so we might spend the most time on that. But yeah, that's just kind of where I would conclude it with that. So
that's I almost want to just debate every single thing that Caleb's just said.
Right.
And so therefore it's going to be difficult to keep this streamlined into a narrower focus. But I am particularly interested in the philosophy around the atonement when you have a fully divine what I call an omni-God, you know, an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent creator God who has full divine foreknowledge. If you ascribe to that version of God, who then knowingly creates everything that exists, all these contingent entities, and knows exactly what they're going to do beforehand, then I struggle to see how that makes sense of atonement. So why he would require, in some sense, some form of payment, however you're going to, you know, theologize your atonement. He requires something back for the things that he created and knew would act in the way that they did anyway. So I would actually, rather than going straight to your second kind of minimal facts or moderate facts, I would like to investigate that a little bit. But my opening kind of gambit would be this. So I'm a skeptic. I'm not Christian, but I'm not anything else. And so if Caleb's position is correct, then it's kind of incumbent upon him to convince me that the resurrection is true. Now, I know he's a universalist, which makes this quite interesting. But if he wasn't, for other Christians, me not believing in the resurrection could condemn me to hell for eternity, or at least not to access God's love and be in a union with God for eternity. So therefore, there's a lot on the line for me not to believe the resurrection. And I do understand witnessing in that context. I understand why it's really important for some people to convince, you know, non-Christians to believe in these central tenets. And I think the resurrection is a central tenet of Christianity. So I would say to Caleb, exactly, and he, of course, that's what he set out, which is you need to convince me why I should believe the resurrection of Jesus, as reported in the Gospels, as the most probable explanation of the data, i.e. the Gospels and Paul. And the last thing I'll say before handing back to Caleb is, do you, and maybe Caleb, if you could answer this straight up actually, so do you ascribe to the maxim, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Because my whole case is based on that.
Okay, so to address that before we move on to other stuff, I would say it depends on the case, and it also depends on how you're defining extraordinary, because I feel oftentimes people equivocate that and don't do it. So I think with the resurrection, was it Joseph Butler who said this? I think it was Joseph Butler who said that all you need to do to prove someone rose from the dead is to prove that they were alive, which we do every day, to prove that someone died, and then to prove that they're alive again in that order. And this is as far as evidence in that case. I can look with my eyes and see that Derek and Jonathan are both alive right now. We know how to tell if someone's alive. We know how to tell if someone's dead. Now, I mean, that gets a bit trickier with medical stuff, but generally speaking, we can do that. And so all you would have to do for that evidence is to say, I witnessed someone alive, I witnessed someone dead, and I witnessed someone, the same person, back again after I saw them dead. So that's what you need for that case. Now, it does depend on, and I know Jonathan likes to do his dragon example, or his example of a dog in a bath, a skunk in a unicorn, or whatever the details of that were, right? Yeah. So it depends on the case. And I would say that it does depend on the kind of testimony you have. So if you have testimony written by one person, then it's not initially as probable. If you have a large group of people, it's more probable. How close to the original events was this written down is another important thing. Was this originally said in a place where it could be investigated, or was this said somewhere far away that it couldn't be? Were these people sincere? Was there persecution? Was there critical inquiry? All of that comes into play. Did this overshadow pre-existing opinions, or does this confirm something people already want to believe? So if you go to a charismatic church service and say you were healed, most people are not going to question you. They're just going to accept it. Or if you went to India and said, oh yeah, I know a guru who went 4 years without drinking water, that's going to be primarily accepted. If you said that in America or at certain other circles, it may be a bit more difficult. If you said that about an Indian guru and you went to Mecca and said that, you'd have a lot harder of a time getting that across. So it just, all of those factors depend on testimony. So yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, because actually I need to go back and unpick something you said. So if you said all you need to do is prove that someone was alive and then prove that someone was alive again after they were dead, this depends
they were dead.
Yeah, or prove that. Yeah. So
yes.
At each point of that, this depends on the definition of prove here, of course. So when you're saying, you know, which is an assent to a belief in a proposition, really it's not actually proving. It's not deductively proving something. This isn't proof. This is actually belief.
It's probability.
Yeah. And so I think prove is problematic there. What I would need to do. So if I said, again, it goes back to these crazy examples. So if I said, "Oh, this person is alive," if I say Derek's alive, then that doesn't take much other than verbal testimony for people to believe that, and they can obviously check it, which is interesting in and of itself. But then if I say, Derek's died, and actually that may be interesting because people have seen him, they may want a bit more evidence because, oh, hang on, and if I said he's died and then said he's risen again, then there's no two ways about it. People will demand a shed load of evidence because actually my claim is extraordinarily improbable, and therefore people will require a matching amount of evidence for the extraordinariness of the claim. Now, this isn't just a simple prove. This is about belief and about evidence to justify a rational belief. And so I think it's somewhat more nuanced than that. What would you say?
Yeah. And I think we need to be careful here because I feel like we're equating evidence for the person seeing it versus evidence to convince someone else. So I was saying, if you were there and you saw Derek alive, dead and alive again, all you would need is to look with your eyes to see that, and that's something you do every day. Now, if you're trying to convince someone else,
I disagree with that.
Oh, really? You disagree with that?
Well, yeah, because if I knew, so again, it's all, you can't get away from probabilities and whatnot. But if I knew that Derek had died and then I saw Derek, I would actually demand of myself more evidence than just seeing him alive.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I would be questioning myself because this goes against everything that I know as far as inductively, but also just my well, everything is kind of inductive in this sense, which is the conclusions I have made of the world and how it works. And so therefore, if Derek, I know Derek's died, and then I see Derek alive again, either I was wrong that he died, or I'm wrong that I've seen him alive. So I'm making a mistake here. So I need to, like the Richard Feynman, physicist said, the easiest person to fool is yourself. That's the person you've got to question the most. So I'm paraphrasing, but so yeah, I don't know that just seeing is proving. I would say
sure.
I would need higher levels of evidence for myself.
Maybe not just seeing, but if you hung around Derek for 40 days and he started eating in front of you and you started touching him, maybe that would be a bit more. Not to get into all of that, but the point is being like, I don't think even the disciples in their state would have disagreed with you on that, because there was that initial doubt, and then they had to overcome that doubt. But I would say that enough sufficient abilities to recognize. The point I was getting to earlier is that recognizing someone, but the difference between death and living is something that's not extraordinary. We do it every day. So the chronological order of that. Now, again, it depends on the claim, because if someone is going to claim, I'm trying to think, like one of the examples would be that meteorites used to be disbelieved by the scientific community because these were just stories, but they actually had the meteorite in front of them and they could look at it and study it. So you could say that's extraordinary because it's not ordinary, since we don't typically deal with meteorite rocks. So I think this is just kind of gets into a little bit of semantics, if that's good. But
it's not just semantics, because that actually fits within a naturalistic framework. So the meteorites weren't breaking the natural law, and no one I think would have posited they were. And if they were, it's because of their complete lack of knowledge. Whereas actually, if you're saying that the resurrection accounts include the miraculous, not only in the death, but actually in some of the resurrection miracles and walking through walls and blah, 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 then actually straight away I'm going to demand, and especially if I'm removed by 2,000 years from the events, I am going to naturally demand for a rational assent to this position, and load more evidence than just some normal kind of, some bloke went and bought a fish from a stall in 33 BCE or CE. So do you know what I mean? And then, because when we do that, when we look at the incredible claims around Julius Caesar dying, or Augustus Caesar, or all these famous historical people, where actual contemporaneous historians with historical methodology were making quite miraculous claims about these death events and thereafter, no one believes them. Right, because the level of evidence just isn't there, and these are guys using historical methodology, but it doesn't fit in with our metrics of how the world works. And in order to believe those things having actually happened, I think we would naturally all demand an absolute shed load of evidence.
Whose metric? When you say the metrics of how the world works, whose metrics are you referring to?
In that case, historians using historical methodology and the historical method, but also all of us as well. Like, I don't think anyone sits down, Christians as much as anyone sits down, reads historical accounts that include miraculous events and goes, yeah, I believe that on that written testimony. I think they've got a much higher threshold than that. And the question is, are they operating under double standards whereby they're not applying those thresholds that they apply to other religions and historical claims to their own religion and to their own religion's claims?
Well, yeah, so I agree with you on the double standard, and that's where I think it's important to lay out certain criteria that we want, which is what I was trying to talk about earlier of like, how long after was there investigation, all the stuff. But to go back to like the idea, I don't know if I would concede, and I think this is one of the bigger issues I have with Hume's objection to miracles, is that when he talks about human experience, he's throwing out tens of millions of people who claim to have experienced stuff like that. And I think another point is that, and this doesn't make it untrue, but atheism and naturalism are very rare as far as the history of anthropology. And for most of human history, including still today, people do naturally believe in the supernatural and that it interacts with the natural. In fact, psychologically, we have in our brains what's called a hyperactive agency detective system. And that basically makes us equate things like natural, like they have actually done studies. There's a good book written by Justin Baird on this, where they study children and the children think certain things. They ask who caused it instead of what happened. So if a bottle falls down, they think the bottle fell down itself. Or
that's agenticity in it.
Yeah. But the point is that that's the now you could say that's just a survival mechanism. You might want to reject that. But the point is, as far as human experience goes, human experience default position is to assume the supernatural is causing a lot of these things. So to say that the supernatural intervened in the natural and did something miraculous is really not contrary to what most of human experience is throughout all of history.
Yeah, but what, I mean, isn't there an interesting correlation that we have become less supernatural as we have understood the world more? So there's an inverse correlation between knowledge of how the world works and belief in supernaturalism. And so therefore, of course it's understandable when you didn't know how lightning works and thunder works that you would say, oh, Thor's hammer, Mjolnir is getting used a lot at the moment or whatever, because that kind of attribution, that explanation is lacking. So you plug the holes. I think supernaturalism plugs knowledge gaps. The God of the gaps argument are knowledge gap arguments. But I think what we've done over the centuries is increase our body of knowledge to really understand an awful lot more of how the universe works, but also say, and you know what? It's okay to say I don't know when I don't know, but I'm not going to plug God into that gap as soon as I don't know.
So when it comes, and by the way, I don't know how long Derek wants us to stay on this part on the historical side. I'm having fun, but
listen, I just want everyone to know I died and I'm alive again. Okay,
right?
So start sharing this myth of me,
and we have video evidence that he's alive right now.
MythVision.
So yeah. I forgot what I was just about to say too after that joke. What was the last thing you said, Jonathan?
I'm sorry.
Just there's an inverse correlation between knowledge and belief in supernaturalism.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So
Although I would agree that the West has become more secularized for sure. Actually, when you look at Gallup polls and stuff like that, atheism as a general demographic of the world is shrinking just because the countries that are lesser developed that are more superstitious are having more kids population-wise. So I think when you look at this from a natural selection perspective, and this almost incorporates the evolutionary argument against naturalism, it seems that that evolution and natural selection are favoring religious belief over non-religious belief because it's more beneficial for gene production. Now that doesn't make it true, but if you think that if our survival is intended to correlate with things that are actually true about the world, then that would be significant. But regardless of statistics, as far as who has the higher head count, I don't know if that's pertinently true as well. I mean, they've done polls in America where 55% of American doctors believe they've witnessed a supernatural healing, and 75% are open to the idea. So I really don't know if I would say we've gotten that much more secularized, even in.
But I wonder what percentage of those doctors are already supernaturalists.
Well, they might be, but that also, I mean, I can give you accounts. Actually, there's an interesting article written in a journal of anthropology back in the 80s by Bruce Grindle, who was an atheist, and he actually believed he witnessed someone resurrected from the dead. And this is an eyewitness account. He was studying a group in Africa of a corpse that had been decomposing for several days, clearly odors and stuff like that. And he was an atheist, and he didn't have an explanation, but he was at least fervent in his belief. So I think what's also interesting is that in a lot of these cases of supernaturalism, you actually see conversions. So if it was just Hindus saying they saw Hindu miracles, then yeah, it's like they might have that predisposition. But to see Hindus converting to Christianity because they think they've seen Christian miracles, that's a bit more of a caveat, and that's a bit more of a jump to have to sacrifice your ideology for it.
But what you never get are people converting to a particular religion, having seen a miracle with no knowledge of that religion. So, and this is quite important. I know it's not particularly to do with this, but you always get people seeing things within their own worldview and understanding. And that then converts them, but they've already got this background set of knowledge about the particular worldview into which they convert. I think this is all thoroughly problematic, and I mean the issue is that when people don't have enough knowledge of how the world works, then we make erroneous conclusions and hypotheses about what we have seen. So with of course an atheist has seen things he doesn't understand. Of course, everyone in every world view, people see things that they don't understand, but it's what you do with that. It's like, am I rationally justified in therefore believing that what I saw but didn't understand was a miracle or supernatural, or am I better justified in saying I don't quite know what I saw and I'm not going to explain it with hypotheses that are arguably the least probable explanation of events?
So I want to go on two things real fast. So I'll take your last point first. So as far as inference to the best explanation, I had this conversation with Matt Dillahunty as well. And I think that you see this in science all the time when we're predicting things like the Higgs boson or Neptune or other things that we didn't directly observe, but were predicted based on the hypotheses. You could even say that for multiverse if it does exist. We look at the data, we look at the math, we look at all that, and we make predictions based on what properties this thing would have. So for example, if someone was healed instantly of a disease after prayer, we could say, okay, either this is caused by some deterministic natural law, this is caused by some indeterministic quantum phenomenon, or this is caused by an agent. Well, we could look and say, okay, if this is a deterministic phenomenon, we should be able to replicate this because that's typically, that's how science works. You should be able to have controlled conditions replicated. If you can't replicate it under those same controlled conditions, then you can look at the other two options. Now, indeterministic causation isn't really a thing macroscopically. It's almost always microscopically. And so that's very improbable that many quantum effects would happen at the same time. The last option is that it's an agent with free will, has more explanatory power. It also makes sense within the context because when you pray, you're asking a being with freedom to come down and intervene. And so I think in that case, we could say that this is the best explanation, unless we find something natural to falsify it later down the road, which is always a possibility. But that's how science works. We have a hypothesis, and if we find something that replaces it better, you replace it.
But miracle, I mean, we never, outside of the resurrection of Jesus, really, we never see people regrowing limbs. Okay, we never see those kind of miracles. They all happen to be rather fortuitously miracles that that could happen naturalistically. Remission of a terminal cancer or something like that. And so, I think that's fairly problematic. I also think I think maybe what you're going towards here is it depends what your background knowledge. So if you're talking about Bayesian probability analyses, it will depend on what your background knowledge is. So if you are the sort of person who believes that supernatural things are possible, when you are then coming to analyzing the data, the hypothesis that something supernatural happened is going to have a greater probability than someone who doesn't believe that supernatural things could happen. And what I tried to set out in the book is that actually there's a circularity that goes on here, that is that people often have, say, in my background knowledge, there is the belief that supernatural can happen, but that actually comes from the faith in Jesus, right? So you're born into a Jesus believing community, and you kind of think, well, the supernatural works, and therefore I'm plugging that into my background knowledge, and then I'm assessing the Jesus claims of the resurrection based on already having a background knowledge of the supernatural existing. Then I believe in Jesus, and then that belief in Jesus then feeds back into my background knowledge. So I think there's a whole circularity involved there.
So first of all, I would not say that it's based on being raised in a specific kind of household. In fact, that's why I was talking about the psychology earlier. I think supernaturalism is the default position for most people throughout history. Again, that doesn't, I'm not saying that proves it's right, but to say that this isn't part of human epistemology or human experience,
I disagree.
You would disagree with that?
So, because when you talked about agenticity earlier, I think you're conflating terms here. So when you're talking about people naturally having agenticity, I would absolutely agree, and I think it's an adapted trait from evolution. But that isn't supernatural. So what they're saying is something caused this, and the jump then is to the supernatural. But a child won't understand the difference between naturalism and supernaturalism, won't understand that supernaturalism is wildly more improbable than naturalism. So I think it's unfair to then say a child is more likely to favor, will naturally be supernaturalist, if you like. No, a child is naturally agentist, maybe. And there is a further jump that is irrational towards supernaturalism. So I think that's
is supernaturalism not the assertion that agents exist in the first place that are not natural or physical? Isn't that what supernaturalism means?
However you define it, and it is natural, it's notoriously very difficult to define. But actually, the child isn't doing that. The child isn't going, oh look, something that isn't natural did that, and I understand the natural world as this. The child is just saying that happened, and I think there was a agency behind that, and it just so happens I'm going to posit something that's supernatural, but I don't actually understand the distinction between the supernatural and the natural.
Well, what kind of properties would the agent have to cause it in that way?
Or I don't know what we're talking about. I mean, if a child, for example, will see a rock in these kind of experiments to do with agenticity. They will see a rock and think the rock is there in order for an animal to rub its back on it, right? So there's a purposing that's going on as an agentist. They see
that's more teleology than
yeah. But it's all involved in the same kind of the way that they're mapping out the world with a fundamental lack of knowledge of how the world works, and so they're making, I would say, irrational suppositions, but again, they don't even know the difference between the supernatural and natural. They'll just say something caused this to happen, and then we're the ones going, oh, what you are positing is actually fits into the supernatural kind of realm.
Well, it's not just children, although I think that's a good example. I'm talking about, like, independently of each other, you have almost every tribe on earth has some belief in either spirits or gods or something in that sort of thing. So that's kind of more what I'm asserting when I say supernaturalism, just disembodied agents that interact with the world, I guess could be a way to say it. But going back, I wanted to address a couple points you made earlier as well, because I know we're throwing out a bunch of things right now, and I think Derek's having fun listening to this. When you talked, thank you. When you talked about these miracles only happen with things that already are easy to cure. That's just not entirely accurate. You can look at stuff like macular degeneration, which has no cure and is irreversible as an eye disease. There are peer-reviewed articles of a woman being instantly healed after prayer, and you have her pre and post medical records. Same with deafness. You do have accounts of amputated limbs instantly restored. Hume actually mentions one in his essay. In that particular case, you had doctors attesting to this, that yes, we amputated the leg and now it's back, and dozens of people saw this. So to say that, these only happen with things that are natural, I think is just not necessarily taking the data at what we have. And so I would say that. Now, going back to another thing you said earlier about people only see, I'm trying to remember how you say it, people see what they already have expectations for, that you don't see that. This is actually a chapter that I'm working on in my new book. And it's something that I think is important to that, is that I think that that's actually contrary to what we see. I think you do have millions of people in cases where they're seeing things that are contrary to what they believe in. This includes Muslims who see Jesus, Hindus as well. Let me give a quote from Hugh Montefiore.
But they already know. But my point was, they already know of these things. So they've got competing worldviews in their minds. So they've been introduced to Christianity, and they've been introduced to Islam.
Not always they've been introduced. It depends on the case. There are cases where they've never even heard, like cases of Hindus. I was going to read a quote real fast from Hugh Montefiore, who was a Jewish New Testament scholar. He had a vision of Jesus when he was, I think, 16, very young, and this is him in his own quotes discussing it. I had no knowledge of Christianity whatsoever. The vision was certainly not caused by stress. I was in good health. I'm equally sure that it had nothing to do with my memories, for I had no memories of Jesus. Again, I am sure that it was not wish fulfillment, for I was and still am proud to be Jewish. I'm at a loss to know how it could be psychogenetic, although I accept my brain was the channel through which this experience came about. I think it's unlikely that the collective unconsciousness, if it manifested itself in a hallucination, would have taken what for me would have been an alien form. I cannot account for my vision of Jesus by any psychological or neuropsychological explanations of offer.
So, I mean, I literally am in no position to analyze that claim because this is the first I've ever heard of it, and it's live on blah blah blah. But you've got lying, incorrect, all sorts of other things that I'd say were more probable. But you've also just got a vision of someone who he later ascribes to Jesus. If he ascribed it to Jesus being Jesus at that time, then he obviously knows who Jesus is. You're not going to have an Amazonian tribesperson who's never been introduced to any kind of Western culture suddenly having visions of Jesus and converting to Christianity, because that just
I
doesn't
disagree
happen.
with that.
Fine, okay. You'd have to provide me some really good data to suggest that that's
I'll let you know when the book comes out.
Right, okay. Because but and I I think the face value, believing face value miracle claims, like someone attesting to the fact that a limb actually grew back or so, straight away it's more probable that person is lying or has made a mistake or something's, it's still the least probable explanation of the data. And I think you are being the least rational in assenting to a belief that is a true state of affairs.
Yep. I don't know, Derek, do you have anything to add on here?
Look, like I said in the private chat in the StreamYard, I was just saying I don't want this to be like 2v1 conversation, because I obviously do lean in the skeptical side. I thought prior probability would be interesting to talk about. Resurrection is the topic, right? People rising from the dead. And what is resurrection? What does it mean? A lot of Christian apologists will say, this is the unique only time any resurrection was a literal physical one in history. This is what I've heard, not saying you. Okay, you may actually be a little more further than a lot of people I've talked to on this topic, but they act like Jesus is the first account ever that comes on and there's a literal physical resurrection narrative of a dying and rising man, or man God, if we could use that term. And from what I understand, that's not the case. That if we were using prior probability that people believe people rise from the dead, whether you take it as apotheosis, whatever you want to maybe make that resurrection to mean and explain the rising or ascension and whatever, the prior probability is that people had these beliefs. These were already things that were kind of in the air. Now, you're probably willing to just go, yeah, I agree. I have no problem with that. And in this particular case, I think this is actually the case. Because if you start with everything we've already talked about, the way that you've kind of approached the world is things like this happen all the time. There's kind of miraculous things that happen all the time. There's no problem. And I could see how an early church father might have a similar frame of mind by saying, no problem that all these religions before Jesus looked in similarities to the story of Jesus, or there's commonalities there. That's fine, but Satan's tricking people or something like this, or whatever.
I think what you're saying, Derek, I think it's really important, because actually the Jews were expecting the general resurrection, of the dead. So that actually there is nothing particularly unusual within with the concept of resurrection per se. Okay, this is something they were expecting,
but it was also in the pagan world. Is my point? It's not just a Jewish idea. It was like, this was in the Roman Empire. It was known. And that's all I'm saying is if you take a prior probability, it was something that was expected and understood in many myths that we would all agree are myths. Even you would be like, yeah, that's mythology. And they still had these things in their mythology. But we find this one where Christianity says, all right, this one is it. And we have the answer. This is the one and only true one that actually did happen. Kind of like C.S. Lewis says, this is the true myth. I know that there's all these other myths, and it is somewhat of a myth, but it's the true one. And I guess we talk about a little bit of prior probability and like how both of you guys are assessing this information. So it's not necessarily only like attacking each other's sides, but like we can get deeper into why do you think that this one's actually true and the others aren't, Caleb, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier with the first, God's reasons for doing this and the idea of the atonement, and that which is more pertinent to Christianity. Not that you don't have certain stretched parallels. And I would say historically, the sources are typically closer than what you have for people like Osiris or Asclepius or other people like that, or Aristeus or some of the other stories of missing bodies. And then, of course, I would say you don't have people still seeing visions of Osiris or being healed in Osiris' name or so forth. So that's typically the initial one I would give. But actually, it's funny because I would go off of what you said, Derek, with prior probabilities, but I would go in the opposite direction, because I would be in the camp to say that I don't think, I don't really, and most scholars nowadays, because it's, back in the early 20th century, late 19th century, the comparative religion school in resurrection scholarship was popular, and you had like the Golden Bough and other books published where they try to compare and find parallels between Osiris or Zalmoxis or Horus or whatever with Jesus's, well, the Horus one's kind of BS anyway, but with Jesus's resurrection. And the more they looked at it, it kind of started to, the parallels were very loosened, because the biggest issue is most of them post-date. Most of them aren't even prior to the 2nd century as far as the data we have, other than maybe 4 or 5 that Carrier would concede. And even those, I think, to define those as resurrection is quite there. So I think that we also have to define on what we mean by resurrection, because when we look at the beliefs of it, there was a spiritual world and there was a natural world. And so when you were a human, you were in the natural world, and when you died, you went to either the afterworld, or if you were taken up to the world of the gods. So those are those two. But with Jesus, the difference was that it wasn't just this is what happens after you die. I mean, N.T. Wright calls it life after death. So resurrection was not just a going to where the gods or the ghosts are. It's going to a new creation, a future state that doesn't exist yet. And so when you look at Osiris and other people, you don't see that. Osiris goes to the realm of the dead and stays there, but everyone goes to the realm of the dead eventually, or the realm of the gods when they're taken up. The difference is this is a new creation. That's how Paul describes it in 1 Corinthians 15, that he's the first fruits of the general resurrection. Heaven and earth will pass away, and so forth. So the main difference is that the resurrection body that Jesus has is a future creation, or at least it's meant to represent the future creation. And I think that's differentiated from assumption. In fact, that's actually one of the arguments I make in my book, is that they did believe in a heavenly assumption. They believed that people like Moses and Elijah and Enoch were taken up into heaven bodily. And that I think if there was empty tomb and visions of Jesus, they would have said, oh, Jesus has been taken up into heaven. And what's interesting is that was also tied to apocalyptic thought. They thought at the end of times, when the resurrection happens, the saints are going to come down who've been assumed into heaven. And so it's interesting to me they didn't see this and say, oh, Jesus was taken up to heaven. I mean, yes, they did think that, but they added on the caveat of him being resurrected. And my question is, what led them to not just to think he was assumed, but also that he had been resurrected? Because that is not something that you see very often in Jewish thought. It was usually just assumption. So if you have apocalyptic expectation, a missing body, and a vision of Jesus, all of that seems to indicate prior probability that they should have thought he was just assumed into heaven and it would be returning soon.
But you're already assuming there was actually a missing body. I mean,
right.
When there's problems with, setting out a prior probability when you've already plugged in some things.
Well, if the body wasn't missing, then that would make it even less probable they would think of resurrection. Now, I know that you take a different view of the resurrection body as far as what Paul thought, but just generally speaking, Jewish belief, having a corpse there would not give resurrection, would not give language of anastasis.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to, I suppose, what you think really is the most probable explanation of what actually took place, and then there's so much to talk about. So I suppose I would say to you then, why do you think the Gospels are reliable sources for, and I would say why do they constitute extraordinarily good evidence?
Oh, okay. I have to tread really lightly here, because I have a lot of friends who are very much into maximal data, gospel reliability approaches, and I don't usually take that approach. Not that I'm not saying I think the gospel is not reliable, but Lydia McGrew and other people don't really like some of the stakes. I know you've debated Lydia too, so I'm not necessarily a gun-ho inerrantist. Let's reconcile everything there. So,
yeah.
But to those who are watching, so I'm not just conceding it. I'm also not saying that I think they are bad, and I think there's a lot more history in there than people grant. And I don't necessarily fall in line with the parallelisms that I see a lot of people take. So I would say that I try to go by more criteriological approaches of looking at, okay, how do we tell what is likely historical in here, what's not? Is it embarrassing? Is it multiply attested? Is there verisimilitude, and so forth? So that's what I would take. I would say that I do think that Acts and Luke are probably the best case you can get for traditional authorship. I don't think the arguments against Acts being written by Luke are very good. I think it seems more likely to me that it was written by a companion of Paul, and if he knew Paul and Paul knew the apostles, you can make a pretty distinct link to that. Not that I would use that as a general argument for the historicity of Luke, but I don't think that it's as far removed as people think, especially if you get into Papias and Polycarp, who might have known John and so forth, and there's all the patristic traditions in there. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Just rewinding a little to what you said, because I think in some sense, because you're talking about how it fits into the atonement and all this understanding, I think there's a circularity in your worldview, perhaps. So it sounds to me that your epistemology is not so much about evidentialism, because you're saying, okay, take or leave certain aspects of the Gospels, but it's more about coherentism. So are the claims that are being made of the Gospels coherent with my worldview and how I understand atonement and how the world works within my... But then that coherence, like fitting in with your kind of framework, the framework is itself derived surely from the Gospels. I mean, that's where everything comes from eventually. So there's a kind of, I don't know, there's perhaps a circularity. Maybe I'm understanding you wrong, but
Richard Swinburne doesn't start with the Gospels. He starts with perfect being theism and predicting why God would do certain things, and then saying, look how this coheres with Jesus and stuff like that. So now you could say he's doing this with a Christian background, and of course you can't disprove that someone's starting there, but he's at least saying you can make an a priori philosophical case without even looking at, and I actually do that in the theology book a little bit, but I would say that you can, from pure philosophy, think of good reasons why God would atonement would be the best option out of the ones given, and that atonement would necessitate incarnation, and that then you could say, okay, historically Jesus might be the best person to fulfill that.
So can you just lay out, because this is something I did want to, and I know it's not quite where Derek wanted to go, but can you just really quickly lay out, first of all, do you believe in omnigod, what I would say, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and divine foreknowledge? So first of all, do you ascribe to that kind of a God? And then how does it, so that's cool. So then how does atonement work? How does God necessitate a payment for his own poor creation that he knew would do whatever it did anyway?
Right. Yeah. So first of all, this depends on your theology and your model of the atonement. I know that you go over this too, so I appreciate all the different models you had. But I would say that it depends on your view. So I do think that God is omniscient. I would personally be a Molinist. So I have friends who are open theists who say God doesn't know the future, but I don't take that view personally. So I think that God creates has a creation with the intention of being perfect, or at least the potential is a better word. So it may be a broken creation. Now, there's a debate as to whether or not did God do this because, given free will, creatures would, you have this term of transworld depravity, that God cannot make a free creature and also guarantee that they won't do something bad. Alvin Plantinga would defend that view. I think it's possible. One could also say that God could have made a perfect world where people would freely choose to do good, but that this world would not be the best world because they wouldn't be responsible, because God would be the one who did this, and it would be better for people to earn it themselves, right? So that would be one potential. But I think another one is that if we lived in a perfect world without a fall originally, it would be difficult to understand how we could really love God in the same way, because we wouldn't even know that we're free, I think, because even if you have freedom of the will, I think part of knowing that you're free is knowing when you can regret things and make mistakes. But I think if we always freely did good, we might not even appreciate our own freedom, because we wouldn't even know it. How would you tell the difference between someone who freely does the right thing and someone who's determined to do the right thing? It'd be very hard to
my first book was on free will. I don't believe in libertarian free will. I think it's one of the most fundamentally philosophically incoherent ideas that is out there. So I contra-causal free will, to work against causality. So I think that any framework that is built around free will, that you start understanding why God did things and created things in such a way, and why atonement was necessitated, I would philosophically say just it's a non-starter. So
are you a compatibilist or a determinist?
So I'm a hard determinist and a compatibilist. It just depends how you define free will.
Yeah, so I feel like most compatibilists are
semantic. Yeah, I think it's semantic, and I would say most compatibilists really are hard determinists, but they just
don't want to admit it.
Yeah, they redefine free will to be just doing what you want. Well, what you want was it self-determined. But anyway,
I agree.
Yeah, but I think this is super important, because if you don't, and this is, Derek and I talked about this in the first video, which is if you can't make sense of atonement. So in this case, I said that the resurrection supervenes on the atonement, and if you can't make sense of the atonement, the resurrection's irrelevant. It doesn't really, who cares whether it happened, because it's just incoherent, right? And you're now saying, I would say that you're now saying, well, actually, the atonement supervenes on free will, and so in a sense, if we're going to debate the resurrection over here, actually you and I need to debate free will over here.
I wouldn't say it supervenes on free will. I think that that's an important part of it. But the theodicy that I would go with, which is sometimes called Felix Culpa, would just say that a world in which Christ becomes incarnate and let me just more generalize it. A world in which God atones for sins and forgives it is a better world than which he didn't, even a perfect world that he made. And so going to why that specifically would be the case, given that humanity's fallen, again, whether they're fallen freely or whether they're fallen because they wouldn't know the difference, that's a whole other argument. But given that human beings are fallen, God, I think, has a few options. God could simply punish us for our actions and say, you did bad things, you deserve to be punished. And while this would be good,
even though he created us knowing that we would do those bad
actions.
Yes,
well, you have this term called co-actualization. So at least from a Molinist perspective, which is what I have. So it's like if a parent has a child and they know that child is going to act up and they know that child's going to do it. The parent is partially responsible because they consistently wanted to have a child, but of course the child is still responsible to some degree for its behavior.
I think that's a false analogy, because I think the parent didn't design every single aspect of that child and then design the entire universe in which that child did that, knowing that that child would do that, and design that universe irrespective. So
I'm not saying God designed I think that, and I know you don't believe in libertarian free will, but I think that humans are somewhat autonomous from God in their wills. So I don't think God, I'm not a compatibilist in that.
But you have a weird semi-open theism. So you said you don't ascribe to open theism, but I think that's where you go, which is like, well, if you're going to allow for some kind of free will, then God doesn't know. But if God does know, either God knows everything and designed us anyway. And this is the whole problem. So it's a grounding objection with Molinism. So I would disagree with Molinism due to
it's my open theist friends would actually agree with you, which is kind of funny. But
let me get the super chat, gentlemen. Scholarvid, thank you so much. He says, initiation ritual, communal meal, promise of salvation, mysteries. Would both of you agree that Christianity is an ancient mystery cult?
You want me to answer that first, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it.
I mean, I know that Derek and Jonathan would have a different view, but no, I think most of the parallelisms you see are quite vague. And when you look into them, people say, the Mithraic meal, but when you look into the differences and stuff. So I think it's hard I think it's also a hard thesis to falsify, because when you look at the similarities, you can point out differences, and the differences are, but they intentionally did this to make it different. And when I look at the Jewishness of it, and when I look at Paul talking about how Peter didn't even want to eat with the Gentiles and the pagans, I just can't see them saying, oh, look at these interesting pagan ideas, let's take them and make it our own. I think that Christianity in its initial sense in Jerusalem was too Jewish for that. I think they would have been abhorred to hear of other cults like that. So that's my take.
And Caleb, you'd be happy to know that I actually broadly pretty much agree with you. So you'll notice, I know you only skimmed through my book, but hopefully you notice I didn't dwell too much on parallelism, because I think that's the weaker side of criticizing the resurrection. I think you can do it. There are parallels, but I think those sort of parallels bleed into just a general landscape of motifs and ideas from which even Judaism was picking from, right? And in this case, Christianity could have been picking from. So there might be ideas that come from without of Christianity that were, it was a fertile sort of landscape to pick from those ideas. But I think that Christianity I think there's an interesting tension with how Jewish Christianity is and how much they want to blame the Jews. So you've got the early Christian movements are trying to separate themselves from Judaism, which is to say, no, you don't have to do this thing. No, you don't have to do that ritual. No, we don't want to be like Judaism, but we are Jewish, and this is coming out of Judaism. So there is an idea of resurrection. There is the idea of this. Jesus is the Paschal Lamb, at least according to John. So I think you had tensions within the synoptics compared to John with how they view Jesus. And I think it's just a big hot mess, but I think it's a hot mess that comes out of the politics of a nascent religion trying to break away from its Jewish roots by blaming like the Sanhedrin and the Jewish powers for the death of their Messiah, whilst also being Jewish and saying Jesus is the Paschal Lamb type thing. Yeah.
What's interesting on that, though, now I don't want to get off a tangent, but just to go off of what Jonathan said, I partially agree with him, but I think what's weird is that from what I understand in his book, he thinks that the Jews were completely responsible for the death of Jesus, and Pilate was not. Later legends attributed to Pilate, but then when you go on to later ones, it goes the other way where the Jews get blamed for it more. So you have this weird shifting where it started off Jewish, then went to Pilate, then went back to Jewish, and I think that's just a bit more.
So I think the Jewish, I mean, we're trying to, it's all inference, isn't it? You're trying to infer from, in author's intentions from the Gospels, and that can be quite difficult. But I think what is not up to debate is, and this is why John is often seen as sort of anti-Semitic and what have you, is that movement towards blaming the Jews within John that you definitely see, and you do see in elements of the synoptics as well.
So is John, in your view, closer to the initial death of Jesus than the synoptics are, because he puts more emphasis on the Judaism? Or do you think that?
No, that's a great question. So I would say that there's some theologizing that's taken place, and he's making more coherent sense of it. I don't think the Trinity is remotely coherent, but would you start seeing Jesus? I'm with Bart Ehrman here in thinking that the synoptics were, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are thinking Jesus was the Messiah. And John is starting to see Jesus as divine, and then that gets developed on in the next couple of 100 years until you get the development of the Holy Trinity as a theological entity. But again, I think it's inherently incoherent. So I have a huge problem with the Holy Trinity, but I think what you've got, I mean, the Gospels are fascinating in an exploration of theology, and they're trying to make sense of the death of someone who was a human, who was a cult leader, who maybe was claimed to do miracles, and he must have had like quite a following, such that it maintained, and they were really upset when he died. They actually thought he was a Messiah at the time. So if you're someone like me, who's something of a historicist of Jesus, but I won't die on that hill, you've got this interesting period of from when Jesus died to when the Gospels were written, what happened there, and then you then have these synoptics that start to make sense of the Messiah dying, and then using the Old Testament to validate their claims, and then you've got John taking it just a huge step further in deifying Jesus.
So do you want me to answer the super chat, Derek?
Yeah, I got two more, or I got this and one more, if you don't mind. Three. Thank you for the super chat, Paul. It says, Caleb, name 3 ancient non-biblical healing accounts.
So first one's come to mind would be Asclepius, who could heal people in his temple. Vespasian, I believe, healed a leper and a cripple, and Apollonius of Tyana could apparently heal and exorcise people. So there you go.
Awesome. All right, Mystic Dog, thank you for the super chat. Jesus lives in the exact same context that Elvis lives. At some point, his teachings and movement that lived after his death morphed into the myth. Would you like to comment on this, gentlemen?
I'll let Jonathan go first this time.
Well, I fully agree. So I think, Jesus became mythologized. I think what we can learn from the Gospels is so far removed from the original historical kernel as for it to be just complete myth. I mean, I do think there were probably sayings of Jesus. So some of the earliest documents, you had Papias talking about knowing the Gospel of Matthew, knowing Matthew, but as some people think it was the Gospel of Matthew, no, it wasn't. It was just a list of sayings. So I think that sayings were the basis of what we knew about Jesus, that then were like narratively sort of built upon, and then you create this mythological biography of Jesus, which has, I would argue, very little basis in truth. Jesus may have said a bunch of the things that he said, but I don't think we can know either way. So it just becomes a case of having educated guesses about how much of the Gospels are rooted in the historical kernel. But yeah, so that's my real broad brush approach or understanding.
Yeah, I try to be careful with these parallels to Elvis, just because I think you have to look at things like, you have media, tabloids, and press that have reasons to report this. That you don't have potentials of persecution, nor do you have this kind of counter expectation and so forth. So I think for many reasons it's not directly analogous, but I sometimes see why people try to do that. It's funny because you actually have I think it's Robert Gregory Cabin was the one who thought that Jesus had an unknown twin brother, and that kind of reminds me of the Elvis analogies of him walking around, people being deceived by that. So,
but in a sense that's interesting, because like a twin brother theory, or some kind of swoon theory, or what I would see as highly improbable explanations of the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, or at least explanations of what actually happened, are still more probable than the Christian hypothesis. or the truth of the Gospels as most Christians would have it. But again, does that depend upon my background knowledge? Are we just confirming our biases?
Yeah, I would say that depends both on your background knowledge and both based on the posterior as well. So points 1 and 3 would be relevant to that as well.
It's something that you brought up, Caleb, in this super chat vein, if you will, how Christians died for their faith. And we know we don't really see that happening with Elvis, but also we don't have persecutions for people who think they saw necessarily, other than maybe mockeries or someone's laughing at them. But in the vein of that, when you look at the religious Jews who were not Christians during the rebellion in 70 AD, or even while Vespasian was in charge, you have him, from what I understand, the emperor was torturing people who were not just Christians, who would not recant their faith. So it wasn't just a Christian concept that they were willing to die for their beliefs and whatever that might be. I find that when Christians use the argument of like, well, they were willing to die, all that says is if that is historically true, and you know, I'd be willing to grant that for the sake of argument, even though like Candida Moss will point out the myth of persecution and things to try and say, look, it wasn't as big as you think. I mean, there was persecution, but it wasn't this massive thing where Christians are just this onslaught where everyone just can't wait to destroy and kill every Christian. Because that happens when people go too far on the other side.
Right.
But it's like, for me, it's like people believe in crap, man. People blow themselves up for things they believe in, and it's irrational as hell. So you would agree with that. I just don't think it's a good piece of evidence to go, well, all it says is they really believed it. Whatever that is, they really believed it.
Yes, but right. So I would not say that if people say that, oh, they were willing to die, therefore it's true, then that's fallacious. That's not at all a good argument. All I'm saying is that if you have, I don't want to pull a Lewis trilemma here, but if you have the options of they were lying, they sincerely believed it, or they were sincere and they were lying, they were sincere but mistaken, or they were sincere and telling the truth, you've at least said lying is very unlikely. So you've narrowed down your options. Now they could still be mistaken. I'm not discounting that based on persecution. Yeah. But I'm saying with the Elvis cases, if people were getting reported in newspapers and stuff by saying they saw Elvis, you could say maybe they're just lying. I mean, that's also, but sometimes I think they are sincerely mistaken. So I think that's the only thing I was trying to say.
This is great. I think it's important too to point out, like, I think you would agree with me, and tell me if you don't agree with me, Jonathan, but I think the whole they were lying, what that means needs to be defined as well, because when one says, oh, they were lying, I think what most people mean is they have intentional motive to tell a lie, right? And one can tell something that isn't true, and someone goes, oh, that's a lie. Well, that isn't necessarily what we're saying. Like, someone can hallucinate. Use that as an example. Someone can hallucinate something and then say, this is what I saw. Or there is this mass influence, as we talked about in previous episodes. And I don't want to get lost in there unless you guys want to. But the point is, right now, apparitions of Mary, someone sees it or they think they see something and they go around saying, this is what it is. They're not necessarily lying intentionally, but it's like there's this group complex of like, we saw Mary, the mother of God, you know, and like they're running around saying this stuff. John?
I don't think there's a cabal of people generating out of nothing this kind of cult with like nefarious intentions. However, I think where there might be some interesting elements of lying is when, so we know that the nascent Christian cults, there was a lot of politics involved, as you would expect with every single kind of organization of this sort, right? So there was a lot of politicking going on. We know this from Paul, and people were vying for authority in the church, and people were vying that their views were more trumped other people's views and their kind of ideas of you know, the religious rituals and what have you. So there was a lot of politics happening. So in that vein, in that landscape, you can imagine someone like trying to maybe, you could imagine sort of manipulating people to believe in something existed, but by putting a whole load of layer of extra kind of you know, persuasiveness, which could be seen as kind of by us, but as mythologizing onto claimed events, or even making up the odd little event saying, "Oh yeah, I had a vision too," You know, you
or
imagine
they
that,
touched him and ate with him, like what we
Yeah.
see in Luke and John. This is something I think Caleb would disagree with me and you on, and that's fine. But the idea that we would say the reason that they take it that far is to answer the polemics against the movement. This makes a lot of sense why you would now have him, rather than in Mark or Matthew, you would now have him. Oh, we ate with the guy. We like Thomas touched him. You doubters, don't doubt. And it seems more of like an apologetic by the author themselves to say, you don't believe? Well, listen. And the way he writes it sounds like he wants the reader to go through the same doubts for a second, like Thomas, but to visualize themselves touching the Lord and going, my God, my Lord, my God, you know, like it's you. And they want you to kind of become the believer through the reading of this literature. That's kind of the point I think you're trying to get at, right?
Yeah, and I think what on top of that, you have people are writing theology, not history. So I'd asked Caleb. So let's take the Synoptics versus John, and you have Jesus being crucified on the day of Passover. You know, the festival of the Passover. He is crucified because he is the Paschal Lamb, right? This is why John has the guards not breaking his legs, in order that that kind of idea of the Paschal Lamb is fulfilled, that we see in the Old Testament. The Synoptics having killed the day before, and in fact the day after, and the Passover meal is the Last Supper. Now, someone's got to be wrong. Okay, so someone's got to be wrong, but the question is, why is someone wrong? And why one of them is wrong is going to be to do with theology. They are writing. I just think that the gospel accounts they all have their theological agenda, and they are delivering that. And I just think, when you go back to the historical method, are these biased accounts? Well, these are ex post facto agenda driven authors writing in order to persuade their audience. That is what they're doing. I am writing my most persuasive piece of text to persuade you that Jesus is the Messiah, or Jesus is God, or Jesus is Paschal Lamb. Does this make me even more reliable? No, it makes you less reliable.
Yeah. So, did we want to address that, or did you want to get to the next super chat? I'll answer that point first, if you want, before you want to move on.
Whatever you look. This is a conversation, and this is the reason why I didn't want to really get too involved, because look, you guys have more than enough to ever talk about. I could do 3 shows with you and never say a word. And I just want our audience to know, like, I don't expect Caleb to have every answer for everything that's ever brought up, and vice versa. Like, you've said a lot of things that it's like, oh goodness, that would take us into a 30-minute discussion.
We can always do a sequel video.
We definitely have to do this more, and I want this more. But yeah, if you want to make a brief comment about that, maybe just like, I don't know if that's even a possibility.
So maybe the Paschal Lamb and John versus Synoptics, or the fact that they're writing theology, not history.
So because I haven't looked that much into John, and I have lots of acquaintances who are far more well-versed in it than I do, I'm not going to comment specifically on that one. But I will say, as far as theology versus history, I don't see the two as mutually exclusive. And I know that there's this terminology in New Testament scholarship where you have scripture historicized, where they are taking passages from the scripture. Yeah, John Dominic Crossan, or Mark Goodacre's term of, I think it's tradition scripturalized. And I would be of that latter camp. I think, and there's a lot of examples you could give, but like even the crucifixion, I think absolutely Jesus really was crucified, and I think they looked back and saw, hey, this is similar to Psalm 22. But I don't think they invented this ex nihilo out of Psalm 22. I think Jesus really was pierced and so forth. I think like other non-biblical examples you could give would be something like where Herod, I believe in both Acts and Josephus, ends up dying of worms. And the reason the authors give for this is because he made some blasphemous claims about God, and so they say, oh, God struck him down with this. Well, historically, we can say, oh, Herod really did die of this, but we might not be able to say the actual reason was because of this. But this was post facto looking and saying, oh, Herod died. Why was that? Well, maybe because of this. Same thing with the fall of Jerusalem, where Josephus talks about James being stoned to death, and he says, and for this reason, God destroyed the Jews and the things. Well, we know that James was stoned, and we know that Jerusalem fell, but it doesn't mean that the actual reason for that was because of it. So I think what they're doing is they're taking events that they have, and they're trying to find it, which is why you have such random verses used, because it's not as if people were prior to the Christians were saying, oh, this is talking about the Messiah. they were looking back and saying, hey, this verse mentions 30 pieces of silver. Jesus was betrayed by 30 pieces of silver. There might be a connection. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to use that particular
So
verse.
you think, because I think this is we just had a whole video on this, Derek and I. So you would think that what they were doing were mapping on what happened around what actually happened around Jesus's death, and mapping that back into the Old Testament supposed prophecies or not, and seeing those connections, where I would say that those things didn't happen around Jesus' death. I think Jesus was probably stoned to death and maybe hung up on a cross, but let's assume he was crucified, right? I'd say, right, Jesus was crucified, nothing else happened. They then go back to the Old Testament, and then they take those elements of the Old Testament and then write those random verses into quite a bizarre narrative set of events. So for example, like you've got Pilate letting someone go. Well, that's never happened. We've got no evidence of that happening. And yet it turns up and it looks rather like Yom Kippur, like redone. And then we've got the casting of lots for Jesus's clothes. Well, we've got that element in, if you extricate that verse from completely out of context and not include the rest of the verses and just take that, and you can throw it at Jesus. But I would say, I think it's much more likely that the gospel writers invented the Jesus narrative to fit the Old Testament verses.
Yeah, and it depends. By the way, we do have, there's a case in Egypt where someone was released like that, and there is a Talmudic tradition of talking about releasing prisoners for a lamb. So just to throw that out there, I don't think it's a completely invented narrative. I think they're taking some kind of tradition that existed like that we have other sources, and they're trying to put that back on the Yom Kippur.
I'd be interested in that, because I don't think Egypt's relevant, but Talmudic sources might well be.
I'd have to look it up. I can send Derek the sources, and he can give it to you. But yeah, I just remember reading that fairly recently. Same with the comparisons like of the Yeshua Bar Abbas, right? We actually know, some people say that has obvious theological significance, but Abba actually has been found on, as far as a name, on ossuaries. And so if it's Yeshua Bar Abbas, Jesus, son of the Father, it's not that unusual. And I get that there's the parallelisms, but Matthew's the only one who mentioned him being.
It wouldn't be unusual, but what's unusual is someone being released by a notoriously unforgiving ruler, and of those two being released, one has given a scarlet robe and a crown of thorns and is mocked, and the other one being released, which is identical to Yom Kippur, which is two identical goats. One is released and spat at and mocked, and has a red red material wrapped around it with a band of thorns, and so this looks like Yom Kippur writ into Jesus' narrative, and I
is
just
this
think
in
it's
the
theology.
Mishnah or I don't remember if that's in Deuteronomy. Are you talking about Talmudic sources for this, or I'm just curious as far as
for Yom Kippur.
No, as far as the robe and the
yeah. So we have Matthew. So that I'd advise reading a paper by Hans Moskika that details all this. I can give you the link for that later. But it's really interesting that Matthew takes the purple robe and changes it to a red robe. Well, why would he do that? The only reason he would do that is because a scarlet robe is relevant to the scarlet material tied around the Yom Kippur goat. So I think, I mean, for me, and this is, we see this when we're going sort of quote mining for the Old Testament for the so-called prophecies, whether it be Psalm 69, Psalm 22, Psalm 36, Isaiah 53, whatever, all of them. I think this is far more likely that Jesus died. There was some cognitive dissonance. They went away, tried to understand this by reading the Old Testament and understanding how there could be a dying Messiah. And they came back and then they rewrote Jesus' death into a new narrative based on what they're quote mined from the Old Testament.
Yeah. As far as the specificity of the robe color and stuff, I would maybe concede that could possibly, I don't think that's that unusual. I'm just talking about the major because I also don't know, as far as we don't know if people were, besides the women, I don't know how many people were actually present in the trial of Jesus and stuff like that. So as far as how much of this they are, and that also again depends on, when we say gospel reliability, this really depends on what you're referring to, because there are some cases in which it seems we don't really know the sources. So when Jesus is talking with Pilate in private, when the guards are talking to the Pharisees, as far as who is listening in on this, I think that, and you see this in Thucydides and other sources where they give speeches of what they would have said. I'm not saying that but I also don't think this was nefarious if they are intentionally fabricating. I think they really did believe something like this happen in their tradition. I'm not even saying that I believe that's true. I'm just saying that's a possibility. But I do think with the major aspects of the Passion, the crucifixion, even probably the trial and Barabbas, I would be hesitant to say those are completely mythologized. Same with, by the way, with the burial as well, which I know you talk about, which I actually really liked your chapter on the burial, because I think you had a lot of good sources there, even if I disagree too partially.
Oh, thank you. No, I appreciate that. I think that's really interesting, because I would argue perhaps your differentiation is arbitrary. So you say, I believe the main things that happen, but not some of the details around the side. I mean, I'd agree with you. The details around the side are clearly mythologized, in my personal opinion, obviously.
Sure. They're not overly relevant to the resurrection, though, but yes.
No,
yeah.
But then are you then not just special pleading? What I'd like to know is, what metric are you using in order to say these substantial claims are true, but I'm happy to let go? Because it looks like you're happy to let go of them because actually they're not that important, but you can't let go of these, not because you have better rational justification for them, but because actually you need them more.
That's a good question. So it would probably be based off of verisimilitude and other criteria. So, if we have other reasons to think Jesus was crucified, and the fact that we have parallels to Psalms in the crucifixion, to me, is not that surprising. Same with the burial. Same with if you're going to take the Barabbas, if we do have other accounts that are somewhat similar, or you could look at the trial where there's apparently all of these discrepancies, but we know that the Pharisees, when the execution of James, were kind of nefarious and intentionally broke law. So if you can find similarities in other external sources, that doesn't seem to me that all that unlikely that something could have happened like this and then it was looked back after. If there was no parallels whatsoever in external sources, that one of the harder examples would be like the guards at the tomb. That's much more difficult to defend historically. I'm not going to take a position whether or not I think that is historical, but it is much harder to find parallels with that. So that would be more likely, in my opinion, if I was going to have to pick a part that I thought was invented. I'm not saying I think it is, but if I was forced to choose, I would say that's less probable to be historical than some of the stuff that we have external confirmation for.
I would agree.
Question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but then what about Matthew's zombies around Jerusalem and the renting of the veil and the earthquake and the darkness, some of which appears in Luke, for example, but generally is seems to be Matthew's invention. So
I actually think that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, in order to trump all the other death scenarios from Augustus Caesar or whoever it is, who Jesus is competing with. But yeah, carry on.
Yeah, I know that you were thinking that might be a reference to Ezekiel or something, right?
It wasn't. But there are darknesses and earthquakes actually quite commonly throughout the Old Testament.
Darkness is a common motif for dead emperors. Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Although what I think is interesting, there was an article published a few years ago in a geology journal arguing that there actually was an earthquake at that time or in that region at the same time. Now we can't prove that it was the exact moment of the crucifixion that it was related to Jesus, but the fact is that if there really was a major earthquake around that time, I think this could be historical memory. Either Matthew, they give three options. Matthew's reporting it like it happened. Matthew's taking an actual earthquake that happened and putting that onto it, which is possible, or Matthew made it up and it also coincidentally happens to align with the earthquake. I think that's the least likely because it seems ad hoc to say that they weren't related. So I think one of the first two options is better. I would also say that I think we have sources like Phlegon who mentioned that there was an earthquake and darkness around that same time. He puts the earthquake in Bithynia, but you might have aftershocks in Jerusalem, and that there was a darkness that happened at noon around the same years that was unlike any other. And what's interesting is when we look at NASA's projections for eclipses, we don't have any eclipses that would have been visible in that region at that time. So whatever darkness he's talking about has to be something quite unusual.
So I actually know a little bit about this, just to point this out real quick, and then I want to knock a couple of these super chats out if that's okay, guys.
Zombies, don't forget the zombies.
Oh yeah, okay. We can talk about that in a minute if you want, but yeah.
Yeah, no, just the earthquake guy actually did a show called the Crucifixion Quake is his argument. He thinks that and this goes into what I did recently with M. David Litwa. M. David Litwa points out there's some factual historical data that the gospel author of Luke got wrong. He was 10 years off, but that it actually happened in just 10 years. It's a decade off from the timing that he's placing into this narrative. But I wonder if maybe the same thing's happening where we know there was an earthquake, and we're tying it in. And we also know darkness came from a storm. He actually talks about like a sandstorm, kind of like what you can imagine when you watch these Plagues of Egypt movies or something like serious sandstorm, like stirs up and causes darkness. Now, is that what that means? That's interpretation. here we go into like interpreting what darkness means, if that actually happened. If we're thinking an eclipse and that we know that didn't happen, then it would be fiction. But if it's not that, and it's somehow a natural storm of some sense, then I guess you could go into that. But you start getting into the weeds of like, what did they actually mean, and why is this not so clear for us to understand and be able to validate, you know?
I think the sources we have for that mention that there were stars visible, so I don't know if I would say it was a sandstorm. But to go to his zombie question real fast, I actually think that, I mean, that's a good one as well, and I think that people will debate as far as, of course, Mike Licona, you know, got in trouble for his view of that, and I would agree that I don't think, as much as I want to say that seems allegorical, it just seems so out of place to me, and I don't think there's any patristic evidence that they took this to be allegorical. So what is interesting, though, is Jake O'Connell in his book mentions a couple possible sources where this also might be mentioned. He points to, I think it's the Oracles, the Odes of Solomon and First or Second Peter, where it talks about the saints being taken from Hades when Jesus was done and being raised. You also have Quadratus in the very early 2nd century mentioning that some people who Jesus raised from the dead are still alive today. Now, does that refer to them? I have no idea. It's possible. But it's possible we might have external sources for that, but it's too vague to be able to make anything for certain. So that's all I would say about that.
I mean, the simple fact of the matter is that Matthew says everyone in Jerusalem saw them. I forget the exact quote.
But many people saw them, yes.
Yeah, sorry, many, yeah. So for many people to see parading dead people, which is also interesting. Earlier you said Jesus was the first to be resurrected. Of course, that's not necessarily the case.
Depends on how you're defining resurrected, but yeah.
Yeah, so you've got dead saints parading around Jerusalem. Now, I'm fairly sure that would be the single most incredible thing those many people would ever have seen. Now, for that not to be attested to in any other source, or as pertains to it seems to that Jerusalem experience, I think is incredibly dubious.
Yeah, and that's actually something I talk about in this new book. Is I don't think that's a very persuasive argument, because I think when we find parallels to modern miracles and modern raisings of the dead, it's similar. I mean, Craig Keener in his book gives, I think, hundreds of examples of people being raised from the dead, and you might dismiss, and you might say, okay, people sincerely believe this, but the point is you've never heard of almost any of these, and this is in the 21st century. Some of these are on video, some of these have, and the point is but the point is that the fact that these still happen and you don't hear about them in the 21st century, where people are literate and there's press and there's video. If you put these same situations 2,000 years ago in an illiterate society, it's not surprising to me at all that we don't have almost any other sources testing this. That seems to be pretty similar with this kind of epistemology.
Yeah, I'm not very convinced by Craig Keener. I know his big book on miracle. You know, I remember years ago, myself and one of my contributors to my blog, who's a scientist, we just took one of Craig Keener's cases, tubular ligation, and I basically just blasted the claims to bits. I mean, it was just so problematic. But anyway, that's my personal opinion. But I just think that's hugely problematic still. Like, if you've got these claims that I just don't think, you know, your defense of the Matthew claim there, I don't think would justify me believing the Matthew claim, right? So
I agree. I think if it was independent and we had no other context with Jesus' resurrection, I believe that it's more likely historical, because I think, you know, if you believe Jesus is God and all this other stuff, but I don't want to say I presuppose that. I think given the other data that I have, it's kind of more of a leap. But I think if this was just an account we had written as far back as it was with no sources, I agree that you wouldn't, on a face of it, do it. You might be able to say, well, Matthew and Luke are accurate in other regards, and so it's cumulative. You could maybe make that argument. But if it was just someone claiming 40 years later that this happened and they don't give a source, and I would agree with you. That alone should not convince you. So
you're kind of in for a penny, in for a pound. So you're saying I'm more likely to believe all of these claims because I definitely believe these big claims over here. So if I believe these big claims over here, then the probability of these ancillary claims is raised.
If I believe for other reasons that Jesus was raised from the dead and that there was an earthquake and all this other stuff, it wouldn't be that much of a stretch for me to think that some weird stuff could have gone on at the time, especially if you believe Jesus already raised people from the dead. So it wouldn't be that much of a stretch for me to think of that. But I wouldn't separate that from Jesus as a person. I don't think you can take that just independently.
Yeah, but it comes back down to the evidences. I mean, the evidence supported. I mean, this is literally Matthew asserting this in a sentence. Literally, right. the entirety of the evidence for the zombie apocalypse of Jerusalem, as I like to call it, is literally one phrase, one sentence in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, that doesn't cut the mustard for me in any way, shape, or form. I don't think it ever could. Like, there's no way that can get me to rationally assent to the belief that happened. But then I apply broadly that to everything that Matthew claims. And in fact, I'm interested I'm interested for you to give a really good account of why the Gospels are good enough evidence to support the claims, to support a rational assent to the claims in them.
Right. I wouldn't say it's just the gospel. I would throw Paul.
Yeah, I know you've mentioned about that. Yeah.
So it's a cumulative case, and it would depend on if we're going to do a moderate facts, I would focus on more specific data points. But I know that we've been hammering on this for like 15 minutes now. So Derek, do you want to move on
I'm not going to stop you guys when you're on a roll.
Okay.
But Mr. Monster, thanks for the super chat. Can I save my soul from hell without Jesus? This
is that meant to be to me, or
I don't want to get lost into, but maybe you could just mention briefly, do a drive-by of like how you view these things. Most Christians think they're going to hell.
So as a Christian universalist, I'm not a pluralist, which is what people get this confused with. I don't think all religions are legitimate. I do think Christianity is the only true way to heaven, but I do think that eventually, including post-mortem, people will repent and become Christians, and that what Paul says in Philippians, of every knee will eventually bow to Jesus and declare him Lord. I think that's the way I would take it. So yes, no, the answer to the question is no, you cannot be saved without Jesus, but I think that ultimately everyone will be saved because they'll turn to Jesus. So that's my theology. But
thank you. Charles Wilcox, thanks for the super chat. It says, thanks, Bieber. Don't know who he must be talking to, one of you guys, because I'm not Justin Bieber. I'm just being silly here. There's so many things that you guys bring up that really, really need like we are literally just playing games right now.
Yeah.
There's too much here. I must ask, if I can, just to get in. For me, it seems more plausible, right? If I'm weighing the evidence that I'm looking at, like you are factoring in modern miraculous claims and stuff. Like all of that is part of your cumulative case, where I'm highly skeptical of like all of the things, because I came out of the charismatic, I came out of the faith healing, I came out of this. I really believed that I was part of the body of Christ, and I would speak in tongues, prophesied, legit sat there. The church talked about how in the third world countries, people have that much faith, because the idea is Jesus won't heal without the faith. A lot of times here, this is the case. They have so much faith. They're not distracted by TV like we are in America. And their healings that are happening in this little corner over here where no one's shining a light on, where no one has any evidence to really show. Like it'd be amazing if we could actually say, all right, we have a man of God who claims he has this ability. He goes to the Duke Hospital right now, where ABC News, everyone is there to see these things, but God has to hide them. And does these really like unbelievable things. I say unbelievable because it's like, I'm not just going to believe them. Like I need empirical data. I need something to actually see, and know this is real. And the way that he does it is like, but he wants everyone to be saved. And he could easily solve this problem by really performing these miracles and doing these things on a mass scale. And one of the things Christians always throw at me, that's BS. I'll tell you why that's BS, Derek. They won't believe either way. Haven't you read the parable of Lazarus and the rich man? And I'm thinking to myself, you're telling me I'm a liar when I tell you that if Jesus appeared to me right now, and I mean this, I say this on air, if he appeared to me like he did Thomas, and he was able to prove that he is who he says he is and all of these things, here, check me out. I'm going to show you. I'm going to take you to a blast of the past. Of course, I might for a second, like Jonathan said, want to check my own faculties and say, am I hallucinating? What is going on here? But if there was a way he could prove these things to me, I'm honest in saying that I would potentially be convinced and actually come to this. It wouldn't be, hey, will you, send someone back from the dead? Oh, well, they have the law and the prophets. And if they don't believe that, they won't believe someone rose from the dead. So I'm just throwing it at you. Just say, like, I wouldn't use that. I just can't. I can't see that being good evidence with all the people dying as we speak. My grandmother just died of brain cancer recently. I'm not trying to make it an emotional, personal example, but my point is, I told my mom and them they're like, pray for a healing, pray for this. And I'm like, Mom, the best thing you can do right now is hope that those doctors know what the hell they're doing. They cut out the tumor, they give her the correct medication, and to try and keep grandma from dying. She didn't die from the brain tumor. She died because the medicine that she had, the chemo weakened her immune system, causing her lungs to fill up with a pneumonia, caused her lungs to fill up with mucus to the point where they had to put her into a coma to try and suck it out. And it was so bad that to resuscitate her, they had to break her sternum to try and do it. All of that could have been like really fixed. And this is just one case among hundreds of millions out there that God could prove Jesus is true and that this is the way. But we have it like in a third world country in Panama on some backwater where someone says they were. That's the stuff I hear mostly. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know.
Craig Keener's miracles, just fortuitously, a lot of them seem to happen in Africa and places where it's like particularly difficult to.
It just would be better if we had a better way to prove that these things are true. Not like eyewitness testimony. I saw Elvis. Well, I don't believe you saw Elvis. Well, she was blind. How do I know this woman was actually blind? Because we have medicines right now that are actually reversing a lot of these things. We have medications that we've come up with that do this. So it's not necessarily an unnatural thing. But a miraculous claim, it's also not a thing we can't test. This is the thing we've had. John Loftus wrote this in A Case for Miracles, or A Case Against the Case for Miracles, or something like that, his book. But I don't know.
I was going to say, well, I'm glad I'd like to talk with John Loftus about that sometime too, because I've read his book as well. But that I would actually, from what you're saying, I would really recommend you read Dr. Candy Gunther Brown's book, Testing Prayer, published by Harvard University Press, where she actually has pre and post charts after prayer of blindness and deafness, where you can have reversal of macular degeneration or hearing impairments and stuff like that. So I agree with you to some extent, although I wouldn't. Again, it depends to me on the testimony, but.
Other prayer tests have shown that the mortality rates of that were actually higher for the prayer group in
you're talking about the Tippling study.
Yeah, I don't know which one it was. Yeah, so I think it's hard.
Well, she makes a difference between proximal intercessory prayer and distant intercessory prayer and a bunch of other features. But I'm not saying that we can go in and predict. Because I think God's a free agent. I think if God healed people every single time, prayer would just be this natural phenomenon that no one would care, because like, oh, I prayed and got healed. Yeah, so does everyone else. So the fact that it's a bit unpredictable, I think, is more of line with the agent than it would be with a deterministic natural cause. But I do think that the better way to do it is to look at case studies and see, okay, we look at this study, we can see this person was diagnosed and is now healed. Can we explain this? Do we have a good natural mechanism to do this? Did this happen in a religious context? And we'd ask all of those questions and try to falsify it, which is what the Vatican stuff does when they canonize saints and look at lords and stuff like that. They get medical documentation and try to do it, and they have a bureau of people, and some of which are not even Christians, and look at it. So that's kind of the way that I would try to go about it. And
which they already, so the Lord's scenario is interesting because the Catholic Church already set out a high threshold, which is to say that it's a very low probability that a miracle actually took place, because they have so many claims. They say, these are really, really improbable claims, and so therefore you are going to have to provide really good evidence to support, or at least better evidence to support an assent to the belief that a miracle took place. And so actually
what you're saying is less probable events are less likely to happen than probable events, and that's just true by definition. Of course it is.
Well, no, actually what I'm saying is that the Catholic Church, even if you accept supernaturalism, it's to say that miracles are incredibly improbable.
They're less likely than natural things. Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then what you do with that is, do you then demand more evidence? We kind of touched on that. But but
then the question is, what's wrong with the sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. What's wrong with the medical evidence that they do present, right? So that would give the second point. If they're going to concede that, and they say, given that concession, we still have this medical data and we still think this is now a miracle, then you would have to take that. But
yeah, I mean, this would take analysing all of Lord's miracle claims. I would be naturally dubious that miracles took place in those. But we are debating miracles, but not those particular ones, because I think you would need to have the data at hand in order.
I wonder if there's people out there too, and this is something to consider. I wonder if there are people of other faiths that are claiming miracles as well, and that they're coming up with test results saying, "Well, I prayed to Vishnu, and Vishnu actually healed my blindness and my deaf." And it's like, what then? Do we say, well, God forgave the name in which he prayed to God because he's really talking to him, the one true God, because there's no other God. And God is like, look, I'm working within your culture, my friend. It's okay that you called me Vishnu. My name is Yahweh. But, I'm going to heal you anyway. And therefore, the Christians are still going to claim the miraculous on their side. Or are they going to say, oh, those are demons that have the powers to heal these people. And therefore, the demons are actually, you see where I'm going? Like,
I think you've got huge problems with intercessory prayers. So the fact that you think you can change God's mind just by throwing in a prayer, and God A, didn't know you were going to pray, and B, didn't suddenly, like, it's not as if God gets a prayer in. He goes, oh, please, can you save my, my Aunt Lily? And he goes, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. I hadn't thought of that. Oh, dang. I just had this sorted out that Lily was going to cop it. No, okay.
Like when Abraham's negotiating with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, he's kind of trying to bargain with him, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And if you really do believe in divine foreknowledge, intercessory prayer makes absolutely no sense. It just, there's no way. And so therefore, I don't know, we're getting slightly off on it.
Yeah, we did. I'm sorry.
I was wondering if I could ask, because I want to go back to the quality of the gospel as sources, and I'd like Caleb, I wonder whether he can answer this. Do you think that the agenda of the gospel authors was primarily to evangelize?
Yes.
Okay. And do you think evangelizing is very much a persuasive thing to do?
Yes.
And therefore the gospel accounts are persuasive writing.
Yes, that's what John says.
Yeah,
and Luke as well, I believe, when he's starting to Theophilus.
Yeah. So are persuasive? What we know about persuasive writing, is it more likely to be accurate and true, or less likely than maybe a historical account, objective historical account?
Do you think your book is meant to be persuasive?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't see the two as mutually exclusive. But
yeah, no, that's absolutely a valid point. But you do admit that these are persuasive accounts.
Sure. So most of history, I mean, I think having truly objective history is hard to do. I mean, even when the emperors, historians are. So yeah, I'm not saying that they weren't biased. I just don't think that necessarily follows. I don't think they were, at least in most cases, deliberately going out of their way to change things that they knew were false to do that. I think they believed what they were reporting was true. You could say they're mistaken about it. But.
And I'd be interested to know what you think of as when they were written and who their sources were and who they're written by, as far as you can infer.
Yeah, so I think the best cases for traditional authorship are going to be Mark and Luke. I think Luke is the best one you can make. I think Mark, I'm not entirely sure. I do think Mark used quite a few sources, though. So I would take the pre-Mark and Passion story, which is why I would, even if you don't believe the empty tomb's historical, I don't think this is a Mark invention. I think he at least got this story. There's a really good article by Kirk McGregor where he argues that it's a very early tradition based on the non-Markan vocabulary and stuff like that. Same with the guard story in Matthew, by the way. I think that's a tradition he's using and didn't make up himself. But regardless of that, I do think that I think that Mark is primarily using oral tradition as to get his sources. As far as whether he got it from Peter, I don't know. Matthew, I think, is using Mark very heavily, and he probably had I would probably take the M and L source approach along with Mark. Luke, I do think more likely than not was probably in a companion of Paul, and I think Luke probably did, besides Mark, have access to some apostolic traditions. As far as John goes, I know some people think it was written by John. Some people talk about a Johannine community. I haven't really looked enough into John to have an opinion, to be honest. But I do think that it's funny because, you mentioned before we went on air that you don't think the canonical Gospels are significantly more historical than the Gnostic Gospels. And I think that's
it's not quite what I said, but my belief is that there's rather an arbitrary line that's drawn down, but that separates it canonical from the non-canonical. I think my point is that they're all extraordinarily improbable, and it probably does get more unbelievable. But drawing that line after the fourth and not the fifth or whatever is arbitrary.
Right, but I do. No, you're good. You're good. So but I think that's interesting. Is it Richard Bauckham who did this? I believe he did a comparison chart where you can look, if you compare the canonical gospels with the Gnostics when it comes to like locations, people's names, external verification, there's not even a competition as far as which one's more accurate. Now, that doesn't mean that everything the gospels report are historical, but I think that there's certainly a lot of history in there, and I think that that's why I'm very hesitant. And people bring up as well of, just because Mark knows such and such a place, people can say, Sherlock Holmes knows London. That doesn't mean that he.
Yeah.
But the difference is that if you're actually going to say these were written far away and years later, it's quite impressive they would know these pretty minutiae details, especially if the authors themselves weren't from the region. I think that just shows
presupposing. But you're presupposing. So earlier on, you said Balcom, you think, did this analysis where he said,
I remember correctly,
or whoever, did this analysis where it looks like which ones are more accurate. But of course, you're presupposing that there are accurate ones. You've already got a fundamental understanding of what is accurate.
By
Do you know
accurate,
what I
mean? As far as archaeology, as far as accurate as far as we can confirm that if they say, if John says there was a pool of Bethesda, and we actually uncovered that archaeology, that's what I mean by accurate.
In places, in non-narrative.
And if you don't think the Gospels were written in Jerusalem and they were written decades later, the fact they would know, and again, you can say, like, I know people bring up Arthur Conan Doyle, but the difference is he actually lived in England, and there's a difference between getting it right, living there at the time, and doing this decades later in a country you've never been to. And we know this because when you compare it to something like Apollonius of Tyana, there's a long portion of that story where he goes to India and he gets everything wrong, and you can tell the author's never been to India in his life. So that's the difference, and we see that in the Gnostics as well. When you have the Gospel of Peter, Herod is the one killing Jesus, and there's a lot more anachronisms, and so that's the difference. Is if you're going to say that these were written decades later in other countries, which I would lean to as well, it is impressive that they are able to get a lot of this right, and you can compare the Judaism of Jesus' sayings had a lot of Semitisms. So I don't think this is just complete ex nihilo fabrication by Gentile authors. I think there was a lot of Jerusalem roots to it. So
So I think it's really interesting that you talk about oral tradition. You're absolutely right. I think all the Gospels relied on oral tradition, and the later Gospels obviously also relying on the earlier Gospels. And what's really Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Before God, Jesus Before the Gospels, is a really, really good book. I'd advise anyone go out and read that. Because he spent 2 years analyzing memory, researching memory, and researching how oral traditions take place and what happens to claims that are made and how they change over time and over transmission. And it's a pretty damning indictment of what almost certainly happened in the lead up to the Gospels.
If I can give a sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, if I can give another recommendation, Craig Keener's book Christobiography, I would also recommend on memory. So just as a caveat,
as a good to
juxtapose it. You read both of them and then decide. We'll do that. Read both of them and then come to a decision.
Well, Ehrman talks about a lot about the cherry picking or the very poor data that Christians often use in order to say oral transmission is reliable, especially in sort of in communities like sort of Jewish communities, and it's generally just not true. But I thought there's a really interesting. I mean, he gives loads of scientific pieces of scientific research and whatnot. But there's a really interesting anecdote that came out of Watergate and Nixon, and you had one of his chief aides basically gave a transcription of a conversation he had with Nixon, and it was all controversial, and this was used against Nixon. And then and he was a really great mind, and there was thought that this guy was super accurate. He was an absolutely on it person. So he gave this transcription of the conversation, and then subsequently the Watergate tapes came out, and they actually had a recording of the conversation. And you have this really great mind that said, this is what happened in the conversation, this is what Nixon said to me, this is what I said to him. And it turns out that he was broadly wrong on everything. Both things indicted Nixon, so it wasn't that Nixon got off the hook here, but actually what the chief aide said, what he claimed took place in that conversation was just wholly wrong. Or at least in large parts very wrong. And I know that's just an anecdote, right? So it has its limits. But out of this, actually, they then started doing a load of analysis into memory and how poor oral transmission is. So I think it's interesting when we say, well, the basis of the Gospels is oral tradition, and then we have an understanding that oral tradition is incredibly unreliable.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on the case, and I would be very hesitant to use modern examples because I don't think that's at all analogous to the ancient world in which memory was the only way you could do most stuff, because most people couldn't read or write. And we know, I mean, I know you cite the Mishnah and other stuff like that. Almost all of that is oral tradition, and that's hundreds of years of oral tradition. In fact, most of the rabbi, Jesus is unique in that he has 4 biographies. Most rabbis might get a mention in Josephus and might get a mention in one of the Mishnahs or one of the rabbinical texts. But almost all of that is based on oral tradition. I mean, sometimes hundreds of years later.
From rabbis who trained all their lives in order to do that.
Yes. Well, sure. And Jesus was a rabbi. I don't see why it would be at all.
Yeah,
we know that there were rabbis who were giving
illiterate
teachings.
Fishermen apostles weren't.
No, but they would have, but they were still being trained with schooling. I mean, not saying the disciples were schooled. No, I'm saying that when rabbis were training people, they would constantly give there were some, I forget which text is, that there would be students who wouldn't be allowed to get out of bed in the mornings until they could recite everything the rabbi told them the day before. So we just know that in Judaism, it was common for there to be rabbis who had teachers. Rabbis who had students. These students would recite back to them stuff they heard. And so the idea that there would be that Jesus would have followers that remembered what he said is not at all implausible, especially when you see, by the way, Paul implying many of these things, where you see him referencing Luke a couple. He doesn't cite it, but he gives the mustard seed analogy in moving mountains. Not the mustard seed. He says if you have faith to move mountains, which is what Jesus says. So you kind of see these very subtle little parallels between Paul and Jesus, and I think that just shows that there was this memory. Of course, you said with the Last Supper.
I don't deny that. I don't deny that there might have been memories of particular sayings, but it's just the accuracy. As you almost admit yourself, Paul makes an allusion to the mustard seed or moving mountains, and Luke makes an allusion to that, but they're not verbatim the same. So no. what we have
don't have to be verbatim. That's not. No, you would. Yeah, I don't think anyone is saying that. If people have a view of the Gospels are videotapes, and this is verbatim, word for word, I don't think that's at all how they're meant to be read. I think these are paraphrasings of what Jesus did say. He probably said them a lot, which is why you have a lot of repetition, and I'm sure that's what they would have done. So it's to me, I don't see that as being overly detrimental. Now, again, I'm not saying that all of these traditions are accurate, and that's why we have criteria to assert what is and isn't historical. But I would just say that, for me, I guess the question is, are the Gospels guilty until proven innocent, or are they innocent until proven guilty? And I would say that because we know they have lots of external confirmation, I would lean towards thinking
lots of external confirmation.
Yeah, what we said earlier with archaeology and people's names and stuff like that. As far as I'm not saying within.
I wouldn't say that confirms the narrative plot.
Oh, it doesn't. No, but it's an inference. It's an inference as far as how accurate the sources they are using are. That's more what it's referring to. It's kind of a epistemic probability as far as if they are accurate in this way. Then same with Luke and Acts, right? If Acts gets a certain amount of things right, and of course there's debate if Acts used Josephus, but that's a whole nother discussion. So,
Luke, there's a load of problems with Luke being an accurate so-called historian. I know, what you think of Richard Carrier, I don't know, but his book, Not the Impossible Faith, is actually a fantastic analysis of Lucan reliability, and I'd advise anyone to get that and read it.
Yeah, I would disagree with Carrier on a lot of the parallelisms he tries to find with like Cleopas and Proculus and some of the. I just don't think that's a good methodology. I had a good quote from Dale Allison about that too, but I didn't want to. I don't know if we have time for that. So if Derek, if you want,
I'll be seeing him in like 3 or 4 days in person. Actually,
Carrier or Allison?
Allison. Yeah, I'm going to go visit him at Princeton, and I'll be there for a full day recording with him, so my Patreon fans can write their questions if they know. I told them too in my Patreon, I was like, if you know his work, because your question, it's got to be relevant to what Allison does. I don't want like in Genesis chapter 3 in the Garden of Eden. It's like, no, you don't understand what Allison does. I really want to like focus in on his work. He's written on Matthew extensively, but also on the resurrection. And in that book, I really love the way he starts off. Like, he admits at the end of the day, he's a Christian, but he's like, I'm trying to be a historian. I'm trying to be a skeptic. I do want to bring up one thing Dr. Kip Davis said here in the chat about the rabbis. He said, what Caleb is saying now is derived from much later rabbinic traditions. There's no evidence that these were widely practiced at the time of Jesus. So this is something else. I think it's talking about the rabbinic or the
traditions of repeating and
yeah. Back when we were talking about the Mishnah or Talmud.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just, he's saying, and you know, he's a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar and stuff. He's saying this stuff comes later. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We didn't get any super chats for questions, but
I'm just really, because I think the core of this in as far as Caleb's second point, which is the moderate facts idea, is so I disagree with Caleb on the atonement and on libertarian free will and all the philosophical issues which underwrite that, and I think that, but that's probably another debate to be had. But then when it comes to this second point of his, the second pillar, I think is this idea that the Gospels are reliable sources, that I'm trying to unpick as far as Caleb is concerned. You know, if we are relying on oral tradition, if the Gospel writers are relying on oral tradition, and they are not eyewitnesses, and we have, you know, certain levels removed from the actual events themselves, maybe as far as 65 years later, or whatever your dating is, I really struggle with, then why should I give these gospel accounts such an evaluation as to then be rational in assenting to their claims as a belief?
It depends on what claims they're making.
All the miracle claims of his life and ministry, and then his death and subsequent resurrection, and ascending into heaven.
Right. Yeah. And that's where you would look into, that's kind of where it would take more of a moderate facts approach, right? Where we would look at each claim, like the death, the burial, the post-mortem appearances, and we would say, are there material? So to give one example, I think I said this last time I was on Derek's channel. Besides N.T. Wright's book, I would recommend a article by Jake O'Connell, published in the Tyndale Bulletin, called Jesus' Resurrection, Collective Hallucinations. And he concedes that, yes, there are people who will see mass hysteria and stuff like that. So he thinks that's perfectly plausible. But he doesn't think that they were bereavement hallucinations, because he thinks the descriptions of these are contrary to expectations. So he spends a lot of time talking about how the Jewish conception of resurrection was about this glorious body shining in light. He talks about Daniel and 2nd Baruch, and I think other places. Even Jesus references this when he quote in Matthew and stuff in Matthew 13. And he's saying that the fact that we don't see this with the disciples' appearances, the fact that Jesus is unrecognized and he looks more human, this doesn't seem to be, this goes against what we would expect, because if they were looking at the scripture and saying we need it, Jesus is raised, well, what does the resurrection body look like? The Gospels describe it in a very different way than the Jewish texts would initially describe it. Jesus is not at all glorious or in heaven like you see with Paul or with Revelation. And
if I may, like Caleb, I have to say two things to that personally. I think too often, this is my critique of modern scholarship, is they stick only in the milieu of Judaism. Like they only think these guys were only thinking Jewish milieu. I think there's a much broader context in the Roman Empire. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to divorce Jewish milieu, but this goes into like the whole Paul within Judaism school thought, and like all of this, like we got to make Paul fit. Well, he kind of fits, but he kind of doesn't. And there's this issue. While I was at Dennis McDonald's with Richard Carrier and I was listening to him, you might not say, well, there's mimesis. Some scholars go, we don't think there's mimetic connection, meaning there's a literary connection between our Gospels and Odysseus in the Odyssey or the Iliad or the Aeneid or Euripides the Bacchae, etc. But we think it's in the air. And even mainstream scholars like Ehrman and everyone else will be like, look, we are willing to admit they know this stuff. Like it's on every billboard, every scene they walk past, there's a play about Odysseus.
How they learn their Greek. That's how
right,
they
learn their Greek. They have to know these stories. But here's the thing. They won't grant literary, but when you read their commentaries, they never say, oh, this trope is definitely hyping off of the Euripides Bacchae or definitely hyping off of Odysseus. And I think we, trying to peer into this 2,000-year-old past, don't give enough credit to the kind of synchronistic, if you will, if I can even use that term, the idea that they are aware of a much bigger audience. So when we start talking about what is going on and who Jesus and how this works, I also would say if they say glorious body is in this glowing light, Matthew 17 being the Jewish gospel, we do see this idea of the transfiguration where he is this light. Acts 2, you know, we do have in Acts where we see if you will, Saul on the road,
you mean
bright
Acts
light.
9?
Huh?
You mean Acts 9,
Acts
not
9.
Acts 2.
Yeah, not 2, but he sees this glorious light.
Oh, I agree. And that's kind of the whole point, though, is that I'm saying because we have this other, we know that they were not. It's like, oh, we can't have him be glorious because that looks too spiritual. Like they didn't mind presenting him in that way. I'm not denying that Paul saw. I mean, Paul described Jesus' glory. I'm just saying if they're gonna have, if they have these, I think O'Connell's argument, if I remember correctly, he's saying if they have these traditions where Paul is seeing a glorious Jesus, Peter is seeing a glorious Jesus, the 12 are seeing a glorious Jesus, there's no reason to say, well, we have to change the Peter part, or because Jesus can't be glorious. They wouldn't have had any issue with it. So the fact that in these gospel traditions, this doesn't mean that the eating parts are historical per se, but the idea that there's a core of Jesus not being glorious is probably something that has a historical core to it, because it's unexpected. And so if we then ask why did they see Jesus as unglorious, then that's where you'd open it to, I would say, because it was an external appearance, but people might have different theories. So that's all I'm saying is I think that it's historically plausible that whatever the disciples saw, and I would include the women in this as well, that it probably was not glorious. Otherwise, it would have been preserved, or wouldn't have, at least have needed to be changed. And therefore, we have to explain why they didn't see this according to their expectations. So that's all. That's basically what O'Connell was arguing.
I'm going to ask a couple questions, and I know you want to jump in, John. I'll let you do that. But on a scale from 1 to 100, putting your skeptic cap on as much as you can, Caleb, because I know you have all these things, the cumulative case you have, but I'm asking you to set it aside for a second and do your damnedest as a Christian here. If on a scale from 1 to 100, where would you put, if you were to put, and I did this to Del Allison, by the way, and he did this. So I'm asking you to hypothetical here.
Right.
If you had to choose which skeptical approach to explain the data, all right, which one do you think is the most plausible? Do you think swoon theory? Do you think someone stole the body? Do you think that they were hallucinating? Do you think, what is the most plausible explanation on the skeptic side? Maybe it's all fiction, right? Borrowing from mythos, etc. You obviously don't think that. But my point is, if you had to put them on a scale and you were a skeptic for 1 second, which one's the most plausible?
It's funny because in the new book I'm doing, I have a whole chapter where I give the best steel manning I can give of an alternative, what I think is the most likely. So I kind of already do that. I would pretty much take Dale Allison's approach. So I would probably say if there was an empty tomb, the body was probably stolen by some third parties, and that I would look at people who interact with bereavement visions, who are hugging their relatives and seeing all this stuff. And I would say that's probably the best one you could do. And that Paul might have had some kind of guilt complex, or had it, in that, Paul seems to be the only skeptic who converts. So I would probably take that route of a combination of a missing body, apocalyptic expectation, bereavement visions, and the latter. So I would also try to if I was going to really do it, I would try to attack the pride and say, well, look, Jesus, he failed at predicting the second coming. This means he probably wasn't divine, and so this should lower our confidence that he in fact was who he said he was, and so we have good reason to think God wouldn't raise him from the dead. So I would, if I was really going to do it, I would throw that in and say the priors. If we know that the Gospels are just throwing in random prophecies to make it fit with Jesus, this is less likely. Whereas if Jesus really did fulfill these prophecies, we'd expect this. We wouldn't expect such random decision, but we would expect this if Jesus was just a cult leader who had followers that were trying to make it fit. So out of all of that, that's probably what I would say. So
I'm glad you mentioned a failed apocalyptic prophecy, because I think that there's so much ad hoc rationalization to like, oh, generation means this and that, and I just think I sort of cringe almost, because it seems obvious to me that Jesus was saying something, it didn't happen, oh dear. But as far as I would actually disagree with you, Caleb. I think the most likely state of affairs is probably no empty tomb at all. Jesus was stoned to death, hung up on a post, and then taken down and buried in a necropolis. But after that, I think the most likely explanation is, if you're going to have a tomb, he was pulled down by a pious Jew, not Joseph of Arimathea, but by a pious Jew, to fit in line with Jewish tradition that the Romans almost certainly would have allowed them to do, which is take a dead body down if it's died before sunset, by sunset, and bury it. And maybe that they couldn't get to the necropolis in time, so they just buried it quickly in a tomb, and then came back and Jesus' followers knew that was the tomb that Jesus was buried in. They came back and then reinterred him in the necropolis, in the criminal's graveyard, and then Jesus' followers came back to that tomb and he wasn't there because he had been reburied a second time. He'd been reburied, and out of that comes all the myths or hallucinations or things that were then mythologized, and the narrative starts forming. But that's if you're going to have a tomb scenario. But I actually think the tomb, just about, I think it's more probable that was made up.
Do you know what's funny is I actually, not with the last part, but with the burial, I actually mostly argue that in my book, and I actually lean towards the dishonorable burial hypothesis up until recently, and Dale Allison's book made me change my mind on that. But
interesting.
Because I did originally think that Joseph did not have good intentions and was burying Jesus just because sunset was happening.
As in Mark, because that's a reading you can take from Mark, which
yes,
is
Raymond Brown takes that.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
right. Yeah. So I did think that, and then you could say the other ones embellished it and made him more favorable. But I even argued, even if that was the case, I think the biggest issue is the same texts that talk about that in the Mishnah and the Simachat and the other ones. They also say that after a year, the family could come and rebury the bones. So even if Jesus was reburied, I think the first would say, "Hey guys, it's been a year. His bones are right here. Do you want to take these to his family to rebury them?" So I think you'd still have to have them come back, identify the bones, even though it's decomposed, take the bones back to the family tomb.
But his family seemed to want nothing to do with him, and then Jerusalem is destroyed. So
Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. It wasn't destroyed in 31 AD if Jesus was killed in 30.
Yeah. Sorry. But as in when after, Jerusalem was destroyed before they started writing the Gospels, I would claim. And so therefore, any claim they make about where something is sort of like pie in the sky.
Oh, I'm not even talking about the Gospels. I'm saying if you originally think that Jesus was buried and the disciples really did believe he was resurrected soon after, I'm not talking about even the Gospel, but they at least proclaimed it. They would have had to come to rebury the bones. That's what I was saying.
Yeah, I think it fits in line with what the Gospels say about Jesus' family, that perhaps they wouldn't have come and reinterred him. I mean, Joseph seems to have disappeared. Mary, what's going on? He doesn't seem to be popular in his hometown. I don't know. And then you have this whole idea that Joseph of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene appear to be, Joseph and Mary reconfigured, and then I think
if I can say something about that real fast, I do find that a little. What was that?
Derek's on mute.
Sorry, I was just saying he's looking at it like literary.
Yeah, I know he is. Yeah, I remember reading that too, and I was thinking that's a bit tenuous. Well, first of all, 1 out of 4 women was named Mary, so the fact that we have someone named Mary in this situation, most of the women, in fact, are named Mary. But what's frustrating is that you have Joseph buries Jesus and Mary's there, and this is meant to represent Jesus' parents. And we say, oh, look, these are very common names, and here's the symbolism. But when you look at like Barabbas, we say, oh, that's a very unusual name. This also must be symbolic. So I just am trying to understand the methodology here of, we have these super common names. This must be
it was actually Jesus Barabbas.
Yes, Yeshua Barabbas.
Right.
But the point of the son of the, but Carrie will say son of the father is a very weird name, and this is clearly theological. But I'm saying that if you're going to say, oh, this is weird and it's theological, but this is very common and it must be theological, I feel like there's no way to falsify this, and that's what's frustrating.
Yeah, I've made no claim about the commonality or the commonness, of the names, but yeah.
Right, and there's nothing at all implausible about there being a woman named Mary or Joseph, and I mean, considering how common those names were. So, and I also don't really know why you would say Jesus was interred by a pious Jew, but it can't be Joseph of Arimathea. It's like, if Joseph of Arimathea was a pious Jew in that tradition we have, what's wrong? Why is that?
Well, I think because Arimathea doesn't appear to exist anywhere, and a lexical analysis of Arimathea perhaps means best disciple town, or I think there's a whole heap of reasons as to why Joseph of Arimathea wasn't a person, at least wasn't that person. And I think then, if you're talking about names, I think you've also got Simon of Cyrene who comes to character. You've got all these people, reversal of expectation motif that pops up throughout the Gospels. Quite.
But again, with reversal of expectation, that's another thing where it's like, oh, look how similar this is to the sources were to the Odyssey or to the Old Testament. But look how it's different because we reversed expectation. So again, I just feel like anything you can defend this any way you want, and that's what makes it frustrating. Is there's no way you can falsify this, because any way you say it of Mark is building off this source. Oh, but look at the differences between this. Aha, but Mark did that intentionally to reverse our expectations.
Well, if there's enough similarity between the sources, then I mean, you can't. It's not like you're saying that that there is no similarity between them. So there's got to be enough of a commonality to you to go, there's definitely drawing going on here.
But did the differences falsify that? Because you say, no, the differences show they were just trying to reverse the expectation of the sources.
Well,
and that's what
I would argue, and this is intellectuality, and I could point you to some books on the Old Testament look particularly at this, which is the differences are what convey the meaning. What's the point of lifting a whole story and then making it identical within a new, that's kind of a weird thing. You would take a story and you subvert it, and the subversion is hugely important. It's what we see in Elements of Moses, what we see, but
to me, and this is just my thoughts, right? I like what you're saying here, Caleb, because this is the reason why Christians, not just skeptics, of course skeptics disagree with Christians, but Christians cannot agree with Christians on how to understand a lot of these things. So trying to formulate a way, and like, we got to approach this historical, literal, and they want it all easy, and they want it as is, packaged really nicely. But as you become more complex and realize the literature here that we're dealing with isn't as it's presented in fundamentalist churches that I once was part of, for example, it's far more complex. And I find beauty in that complexity. I find beauty in seeing that these authors were far more intelligent than, I'm just writing what literally was said to me, and this is literally what is true, and literal historical. There's a complexity to the narrative and the literature, as M. David Litwell points out, and there's many other scholars who say this, but it's historiography and mythoi, the combination of a literature with historical, geographical locations, with people, places, and things are inserted into the narrative format, makes these authors creative. And it tells you that this gets into the whole genre thing. Like, what are we reading? Are we reading literal historical accounts here of an actual historical, this is the case?
A great example of that, Derek, is the road. Sorry to interrupt, but is the road to Emmaus, right? So that to me is just a hugely theological story. There is when I read that, there's nothing about that that's historical. That this is clearly a story of like, I don't recognize this person until I sit down and break bread with them. What's that telling me? It's building on loads of motifs about not recognizing, and in fact, Dennis MacDonald would have something to say about the road to Emmaus. There's a lot, it's arguably building on some pre-existing Greek material, but it seems completely theological in what it's trying to say and trying to do. But when Caleb is talking about evidence that would prove that Jesus was alive, that Jesus died, and that Jesus was alive again, that Jesus was alive again are the appearance accounts. Now, if you're saying, right, okay, so if I believe in the resurrection, I have to believe that the appearance accounts really actually happened. So I go to one of them, and the road to Emmaus looks incredibly theological and like it didn't happen as a historical thing. It's trying to tell me theology. I get that, and it's a great piece of writing in that respect, but it's not doing history. And so therefore, I'm left thinking, well, actually, I haven't been given stuff that reaches a threshold of rational assent to the belief that Jesus was resurrected.
Yeah, no, I don't think I have any initial comments other than I don't necessarily buy the parallels to Romulus and Cleopas that some people would try to throw out. So we're talking about the Cleopas narrative, but yeah, I didn't know if any other comments.
Yeah, it wasn't to Romulus, but there were some others.
By the way, before I forget, so I don't want to go back to Joseph Marathea, but I'll do it really quick just to address some things. I also would disagree that I think, and from what I've read, most scholars would take that Arimathea is just referring to Ramatha, which is in 1 Samuel, and Josephus mentions it too. And actually, the Septuagint spelling of it is very similar to how the New Testament spells it. So, actually, the letter you cited from Carrier, he mentions that towards the end. He's saying it's possible this is what it's referring to. Origen or Eusebius, I forget which one, takes that. Tertullian. One of the church fathers takes that view as well. And I think that's perfectly plausible. That's referring to. We also, by the way, don't have much of a habit of Mark making up the names of places. Most of the places Mark talks about are readily identifiable on a map. And so the fact that he would make it up in this particular case doesn't seem like it's a prior probability kind of thing. So I would think that it's probably referring to Ramatha, and that seems to be the most natural interpretation. And I've also, from what I've read, that I've only heard, Carey is the only person I've heard actually say that the translation refers to Bessa Town, and from reading other sources online, that's a very questionable exegesis of it. I'm not saying it's wrong, but other people say
well,
it's quite a literal. You could read it other ways as well.
Yeah, I mean, as far as Greek's concerned, it is quite prima facie reasonable, as in Ari and Mateus. But I take on board that you think it refers to another place. I mean, whether someone from somewhere all that way out would be Sanhedrin. I mean, any claim about the Sanhedrin members, of course, you can claim anything about them because all the records get destroyed in the fall of Jerusalem. But going back to sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and the reason that I don't take actually the view of the burial now I have is that I think it was quasi dishonorable. So I think what Joseph is doing is that he is technically burying Jesus without mourning, without his family, because he's following the law. But I think he does have, I wouldn't say he was a disciple. I would say that he has sympathies. And so he's basically putting lipstick on a corpse. He's trying to make it as nice as he can, even though he's technically still burying it without the dishonorable things. And I think that Bex explains why you see both honorable and dishonorable elements. Byron McCain points that out. I know you quote his article as well. And I think that what convinced me by Allison's arguments is Allison says that let's imagine that Jesus really was dishonorably buried by the Sanhedrin and the disciples knew about this. I think they would look at Isaiah and say he made his grave with the wicked. That's perfectly consistent with what would have happened to Jesus. So I don't see why they need to go change this to say, well, we need to make it different. They would say, no, look, Jesus was buried with the wicked. That's what happened. This is fulfilling prophecy. That's what we're doing. And the reading of Isaiah 53:9 of the rich man, I think, is actually meant to be a negative connotation. And there's a good paper by, I forget his name, but it's called like the wicked wealthy in Isaiah 53:9. And he basically says that the context of Isaiah, the rich man is actually meant to be an insult, like the rich oppressors, like what you see in James 2:6. And so when it says he made his grave with the wicked,
how would that fit with Joseph? I mean, just to explain this, sorry to interrupt, but to explain this to some of the viewers who might not know what the heck we're talking about, is that in Joseph of Arimathea is labeled as a rich or prominent man by the Gospels, and this is referring back to a previous set of verses in Isaiah, which talks about buried. I forget the exact.
He was a rich man in his great death.
Yeah. Yes,
he made his grave with the wicked. He was buried with the wicked, but he was a rich man in his death. Is what it
so says. So the idea that if you think that is a negative connotation, then how does that fit with Joseph of Arimathea as presented in the Gospels? I mean, or did the Gospel writers not realize that it was because I think they sometimes mistranslate or misunderstand certain Old Testament claims that they make.
They would, but I'm just saying they have no reason to invent this, because if Jesus was dishonorably buried in a criminal's grave, this is perfectly consistent with Isaiah. That's all I'm saying. So they wouldn't need to say it to invent this character. Also, the fact that they actually wanted to emphasize Jesus' embarrassment with the passion. Jesus is mocked, he's killed, because this is, he's dying for our sins. He's putting on all the shame. So I don't think they would say, let's have him be embarrassed with the burial, but we can't have, embarrassed with the crucifixion, but we can't have him dishonorably buried. That would be too much. I think that all that would be negated by the resurrection, by him overcoming this shameful grave. And so I just don't see any motivation for the Gospels to suddenly feel that they can't embarrass Jesus now, even though they did it before. And the fact that this would be perfectly consistent with prophecy, I think they would have every reason to include a story of dishonorable burial. And the fact they don't is very surprising to me. And so because I can't think of any reason why this, at least any good one, that I think this would be invented, I think this probably is being reported as it was mostly. And I think they were confused. I think Joseph being a follower, I don't think he went out and became a disciple or converted. I think this is their interpretation. I think the women saw Joseph doing this and they were really confused as to why a Sanhedrin member would do this. And that was their interpretation. Maybe he felt bad for Jesus. Maybe he was sympathetic. We don't really know. And that was their saying, well, maybe he is a secret disciple. And that's why he was a secret one, because he didn't come out and say it, So I think that's what the gospel authors are doing. And I think they were just equally as confused as to that.
Which is quite an interesting thing, because what you appear to be doing to me is taking some of the claims from the Gospels and saying, actually, if I take them at face value, then these are quite problematic. So I'm just going to interpret them in a way that is slightly less problematic, but is therefore more appealing to me as a rational human being. And it's all about like how far do you take that, and how much can you jettison from the gospel narratives until you're left with just this core thing. You say, right, I can believe this happened, and I don't know. You seem to be happy or okay with jettisoning quite a lot of the ancillary stuff, leaving some basic ones, and then reinterpreting things in a certain way that means that actually I can see that slightly rational now. And then of course it comes to I was trying to get onto the kind of appearance. We're probably running out of time, but the appearance claims like the road to Emmaus, if you're like, well, that's theological, then but that leads into the evidence for the resurrection. And if I see that as theological, not historical, then actually what basis do I have for believing that Jesus was actually resurrected when it's just written down in third, fourth, fifth hand accounts written by gender-driven authors 45 to 65, 80 years later? You know, there's a lot of that I've said there, I'm sorry, but
no, it's good. Yeah, I would just say I will grant that the road to Emmaus story is nowhere near as historically attested as far as like the evidence for the appearances to Paul or the disciples is much better than we have for Emmaus. So I'm not going to argue that at all. But I'm also not, you know, the Emmaus story could be completely fictional and that would not affect my case. And people who use minimal moderate facts don't usually incorporate it anyway. So to me that wouldn't affect it. And I get what you're saying is it's a cumulative thing of if they're willing to stretch the truth here, why not do it in other places? And that's a fair argument. That's also what people who take more of the McGrew's approach would say, oh, but if they're telling the truth here, they wouldn't. So I think both sides can pick and choose that. But that's why I'm trying to stick to like criteriological, which is why I point out the idea of like, well, Peter would have seen a glorious Jesus. And so I think this particular account has a historical core because of this elements and stuff like that. So it's really a case-by-case basis and just applying it to certain criteria of saying, well, I don't think they have any reason to make this part up because it would be counterintuitive and all this stuff. So that's kind of more where that part goes. But
I always see that as a kind of sticking plaster approach to like, this is how I solve that, this is how I solve that, this is how I solve that. And it just becomes a big ball of sticking plasters. I see this.
I wouldn't say solve. I would just say using the criteria we have historically and trying to find the best explanation for each one. So that if that means certain cases are mythological, it does. If it means certain ones are historical, it does. But we need to have a reason. We shouldn't just pick and choose. We should have reasons for asserting it's one way or the other.
No.
I think this is interesting because it's unfalsifiable at the end of the day, and we're literally trying to go, well, Joseph of Arimathea could fit this passage here in Isaiah 53. And I'm not saying what you say didn't like make sense. What I'm saying is there's other ways that it makes just as much sense fictionally. I mean, it makes just as much sense as the narrative as it does to try and like rationalize how this could be historical and still somehow can attach to an Old Testament prophecy.
Well, that's the part I was disputing, Derek. I don't think it makes sense fictionally because I think it would make more sense if they reported Jesus was buried in a criminal's tomb, that would be more consistent with prophecy than it would be for Joseph to bury him in a family tomb. That's all I was saying. So I don't think it makes sense as fiction. That's what I was saying.
Yeah, I mean the whole nature of the empty tomb. I mean, this is what I haven't talked about this with Derek yet, but I'm with Carrie on this, which is this is a bodily resurrection, which is why you get to John and he's poking the body and eating broiled fish and all this stuff, which is to me, why would he include those things? That's telling you something. What is it telling you? Well, it's telling you that Jesus was a body. Why would John want to tell people that Jesus was a body? Because there are people that believe the resurrection wasn't bodily. I understand that, right? This makes total sense, which is why I would argue the whole empty tomb narrative comes out of trying to establish that Jesus raised not bodily, not spiritually, but in bodily form.
See, that's interesting because that is true. That's a very common view that the feeling narratives are meant to be anti-Docetist, right? Of we have to touch Jesus now. But what's interesting to that is then it's also weird to explain why do Luke and John have Jesus walking through walls and disappearing? Because wouldn't we want him to be more physical? Because if the Gnostics because when you look at like Ignatius, for example, and he's trying to get rid of the Gnostics, he says, look, we know that Thomas touched him and they did this stuff, but Ignatius leaves out the parts of Jesus vanishing because the Gnostics would say, well, look, Jesus, can a body walk through walls? Can a body vanish? And so I think if they're trying to do this by including those details, they're almost being detrimental because they're almost going to hurt their case by including this because it goes.
I don't think coherency needs to come into it because at the end of the day, Jesus was scourged, crucified, died, emaciated, sliced, all this, and then when he comes back resurrected, he's all kind of healed up, but he's got a couple of holes in his hands, type thing. And so there's just complete suspension of disbelief here because it's like it's just not coherent. I don't think.
So you think they're being inconsistent?
Yeah. I think there's half. I think if you were to sit down and from now as a modern skeptic, if I was to sit down and invent a Jesus narrative, I could probably do a better job which you might then say, well, that's evidence that it's actually more reliable, because look how bonkers some of it is, and if they were making it up. But they're not making it up. They're taking on oral traditions from different sources, and you've got to remember that Mark won't have had Matthew, Luke, and John to refer back to. He's just going on oral tradition. And then you've got Matthew and Luke. They may or may not have had access, but they wouldn't have had access to John. John's possibly got access to all of them and oral tradition. You've got a bunch of different sources coming together and being brought together, and then someone redacting that and making sense of that, which is one person's mind trying to make sense of all these things. Now, there's some great writing, some awesome stuff going on, and some great theology, or very involved theology, but it doesn't stop there being just a lot of incoherence in the narrative, I would argue.
Right. I would. Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
No, Caleb, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No. I would just say, I think that's to me why I think that, I mean, there's multiple reasons why I would argue that the eating and stuff is historical, although I think the anti-Docetist argument on its face is persuasive, but because you also have those other elements, the explanation that has better explanatory power to me is that, well, Jesus also was physical and also disappeared, and that's why they're reporting it. Whereas if you're going to say, well, they want to make him look physical, it is a bit hard. I mean, you can say they're just being inconsistent, but that is a bit more ad hoc and arbitrary than to say, as far as their motivations go, as if they didn't notice that or something. So to me, and there's also, Acts 10:41, which is probably a pretty early creed, mentions eating with Jesus as well. So I don't see this as being necessarily late. And what's funny is that in the Gnostic text, you have this with the opposite. You have, like, I forget which text it is, but Jesus is walking on the beach with one of the disciples, and it says he doesn't leave any footprints. Like, it's saying he's like this ghost, or he's on the cross but feels no pain. And so I think when people say that these texts were trying to refute Docetism, I think that you could look at the other way around. The earliest ones depending on what you think of Paul's nature is, the earliest the Gospels canonized are at least earlier than the Gnostic ones, and they are trying to say, here is Jesus eating and stuff. The later Gospels also tried to refute this by saying, no, Jesus didn't feel pain on the cross. Jesus was immaterial. So the earlier sources are actually seem to be referring to a physical resurrection, and the Gnostic sources are trying to refute that. So I think the complementarianism there is really interesting. That for me, the earlier Gospels actually seem to be the ones bringing up the notion of it, and the Gnostics are trying to have polemics to refute the canonized versions of it. But
I just, if you're writing a narrative where at the end of the narrative, this body flies up into heaven, I think you're pretty much saying that the body can do anything. Yeah.
Right. Luke says that. Yeah.
And here's the thing. Docetism, I think, is obviously possibly being combated in John, but also it could just be skeptics who aren't believing this. They have different ideas of a resurrected body, which, James Tabor, I recently went and interviewed him, and he actually thinks Allison's wrong on the continuity between Paul and the Gospels. He thinks that and of course, Allison disagrees. Allison thinks that Paul.
I would be on Allison's side on that, obviously.
Yeah, obviously. But I mean, he's like, no, like there are multiple ideas in antiquity on a resurrected body and what kind of body this would have been. And it's not like immaterial metaphysical, like spirit, the way we would think of it as today. It is a spirit matter, but not the physical flesh and blood. This kind of literal corporeal, like a corpse, if you will, idea. But Mark does seem to indicate empty tomb. Paul says he was buried, doesn't say in a tomb, doesn't give any of this. And there's scholars all over the place on this. Like Dr. Bob talks about, Dr. Robert M. Price says, he wonders if 1 Corinthians is a creed that's interpolated later, because it has the 12 and then it has the apostle. It's like you start to distinguish groups. Are we trying to make sense of this? 500 witnesses. That sounds like Pentecost, mistranslated in Greek. There's so much stuff to really, like, at the end of the day, when you're taking this seriously and you're not like, I had an experience. I went down to the altar call. I felt an emotional affection of the Lord forgiving me in some psychological, satisfactory way. And you take this seriously. At the end of the day, we have the most sharp minds in the world that are like coming at odds and saying, we cannot actually be confident on what we have. It's got to come down to personal experience. And Del Allison actually said when he was a teen, he had an experience when he accepted the Lord in his life. And he said, I couldn't explain it, which I think we could. I mean, I feel like I could explain it. That doesn't mean I can take away by explaining what I think is happening there in his brain and in his experience and whatnot. I'm not trying to take away the experience and act like, oh, well, it's just like downplay what he experienced. like I'm not trying to downplay what the early church people who are in this movement, this cult, are experiencing. I think they're experiencing something. I'm not downplaying that. Just like Darren Brown gave an atheist woman a religious experience, and it's all fabricated, even though it was real to her. So I'm saying
you've got to remember there are 35 odd years before the first gospel is committed to scrolls, right? So you've got 35 years of oral traditions going all over the shop, of all different sources, politics going on, different sects within Christianity that were growing out, arguing with each other, and then you're committing Mark to some kind of permanency, and it's just, there's just so much scope for the lack of reliability going on. And we, as you say, all the scholars now are getting different things out of it. You know, there's an argument to say there's an inherent lack of clarity going on in the core revelations of Christianity, and if that's the case, then it's not a very good revelation. You know, if Caleb is talking about how he differs so fundamentally from some of his fellow Christians, and he's a universalist and other Christians aren't, then I'm sitting back with popcorn, just going, well, this just shows the how poor the revelation is as far as getting, if you want to get everyone universally on board, if you want to get everyone on board with, if your job in delivering a revelation is to get people to enter in union with God, then I don't know. I think the Gospels and
I think Caleb can. I think you sympathize with us in the sense of saying, of course, you think we're wrong, and you have your reasons for why you believe the way you do and accept this. And you would be very sophisticated compared to some of the Christians that I have conversated with. I must admit, you are.
Thank you.
At the end of the day, though, it's like we don't have a particular. I mean, I'm biased for naturalism, like I am. I commit to that. I say that openly. Like, I'm biased about this. I think the natural world explains things better, and even coming down to experiences. Whereas, like Allison was talking about this, there are people who've had experiences, modern day examples, where they say their dead son, who's been dead for years, came and hugged them and physically picked them up off the ground. Mm-hmm. Physically, like they felt them hug them and they lifted them off the ground. And I'm thinking to myself in my head already as a naturalist, like, and you might go, that's the problem. You're already starting with a epistemological.
There's heaps of research to suggest that these sort of experiences really do, or people feel that they really do happen in an awful lot of cases. And actually, no third party really believes that actually happened. But what we do is we present hypotheses of how that person could come to believe that it happened.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think that's what Allison is saying. I think that because I know Allison thinks that the resurrection appearances are visions, but I think he doesn't think all visions are hallucinatory. He thinks that some of these apparitions, from what I understand, he thinks those could be legitimate. So he's saying, yeah, maybe it's like this, but I also don't think naturally that those are. And I have in the appendix to the book I'm working on, I have a section on apparitions and near-death experience and stuff like that. And although I would concede that I think most of those are bereavement, it really depends on the case, because there are some really interesting ones where they are getting information that they shouldn't know. Like if someone sees their dead relative, it's like, okay, you know, that could be hallucination. But if someone, and there's plenty of cases where they see someone that they didn't know was dead, like let's say they see their brother who's fighting overseas and he appears to them at 3 a.m. and says, I love you, I've deceased, and vanishes. And she wakes up the next morning and finds out that her brother died at 3 a.m. that very night and all that stuff. That would be more interesting to me. It's like, okay, now we have something that could be falsified, and that's a bit more interesting, or people getting information stuff. So I wouldn't put too much weight into that, but I do think that's how I would try to look at different cases if they have verifiable information like that or not. So
interesting.
Quantum tunneling.
Yeah.
No, dude, This is awesome. I want to ask you guys as we close. How did you feel about this discussion? I mean, I didn't want it to be a debate as much as I want it to be a discussion. You guys got to engage, though. Tell us what you think.
It's made me realize. So going in with no planning, if you like, of how to do it meant we jumped all over the shop and we're dipped into all these different places, which I think is interesting. It was a conversation. This was a natural. If Caleb and I went down a pub and had a chat, this is what we would have done, right? But what's interesting now is that I now have a much clearer understanding of where I would go with Caleb next, which is start with a philosophy. I mean, this is kind of what you do actually with everyone about everything, which is we need to go to the bottom of the pyramid of your entire worldview, right? We always argue up here, right? Of politics, morality, and stuff. The arguments happen up here, right? But that depends on your epistemology. Your epistemology depends on your or your natural theology, and your natural theology depends on your epistemology, and your epistemology depends on your ontology. So what we need to do is argue down here about some of the really basic ideas, because if his ideas of atonement depend on that and his ideas of resurrection depend on that, then actually we need to go down to the bottom, argue here, work our way up. I don't know, that's just my opinion, but I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would agree with a lot of that being said. I think your priors are going to affect your view greatly. I think posterior information is also relevant, and I think that although I disagree with Jonathan a lot on the scholarship, I think he's very competent as far as his ability to write, and it is I thought his book was pretty interesting. I think he hampered on a lot of things that I'm glad that he went to the Trinity and the Atonement, and I'm glad that he spent a pretty good chapter on the burial, because there are things when I'm reading books both on Christian and skeptic side, I'm like, oh, they left this part out, they should have mentioned this. And I was pleasantly surprised to see Jonathan mention stuff like that, because to my knowledge there hasn't been too many resurrection books critical of it where they try to attack the atonement or the Trinity or something like that. I think that's very important.
I agree with that.
And that's how I would try to do it if I was a skeptic and stuff like that. I think he looked more into, I'm also glad, when I say the burial, I'm glad that he didn't try to go for the whole Ehrman idea of, they didn't bury crucified victims. Like, I think that I see all the time, and I think that's just wrong. And I'm glad Jonathan agrees. And there are arguments on both sides, I think, from even our own camps that neither of us like. I think I think Jonathan would say probably doesn't like the Jesus wasn't buried argument. If I could think of lots of apologetic arguments on my side that I don't like. But that's not to say that I agree with everything Jonathan writes. There are some.
Yeah,
there are a lot of good things. Sorry, go ahead.
On that, Caleb, because that's a really interesting point. I used to believe in the cross and pick at the. I used to argue that, and then it was actually talking with Richard Carrier, who said, "Mate, actually, you can't believe that. It's a load of rubbish, and this is why it's a load of rubbish." And then I was like, "Yep, you have presented to me really good evidence why I shouldn't believe that. I can't contest that. I can no longer believe that Jesus was left on the cross to die. I'm totally, which to me was really good. Which I know it's like patting myself on the back, but here was an account that it would have been easier for me to go with the pecking the body, because actually that fits even better with the skeptical thesis. So I did change my mind completely. But sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's great. I actually, as much as I disagree with Carrier on scholarship, I actually really did like overall his article on the burial in the book, The Empty Tomb. I think it's probably the best thing he's written. I know he would disagree on that, but that's like the thing where I'm like, wow, I actually think his chapter on the stolen body is actually pretty decent too. Even though I don't disagree with it, I think it's the best skeptical one you could do. And so if I can give him compliments, which is, I was also, by the way, I'm glad that you also had a chapter on veneration. Although I was disappointed that you didn't go into great detail on the Church of Holy Sepulchre, because I do that in my book, and I think that that's a very underrated argument. And I think there's actually a lot of good archaeology behind the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So I was like, okay, he's bringing this up and stuff, but I was like, oh, I wish he went into, here's all the problems with why this isn't the site. But I'm glad you at least mentioned it. So that's a whole nother conversation. But I think it was nice to see both of us get on certain things and stuff. So I like the structure of your book overall. And you also had the chapter on Habermas's 75% statistic, which I also thought was nice, because that doesn't get brought up that much on the skeptical side. And so I thought that was nice to see at least an attempted rebuttal of that. So that's another compliment I'll give you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to have to, because you've been so nice, I'm going to have to buy your book now, aren't I?
That was the whole plan. That was the whole plan this whole time.
Sold one more book.
Yes.
Actually,
I'll sit when the next one comes out, which will be more on the miracles and stuff like that. I'm sure you probably will be interested to see stuff. So I'm sure I'll give you and Derek copies, and you all can try to do a rebuttal or something if you want. I'm sure that'll be.
Or have you come on and do like we did today with maybe other people, maybe having Jonathan again or other scholars.
John Loftus, maybe, I don't know. Huh?
Yeah, I can contact him. He might be interested in doing the debate on miracles and stuff. And because he's done those before. He's a friend of mine. All of these guys are friends of mine. I've also got friends who are Christians. I hope people know that. That's why I always tell people in the chat, try to be as reasonable and kind to my guest as you possibly can. They are human too. They bleed red. They have heartbeats.
Some of my best friends are Christian.
Hey, my mom, every time I turn around, like everybody in my family just about. And so,
that's I'm not racist, but so that's what
I have a friend. Yeah.
No, I'm serious. As in, like, that's I helped a Muslim 4 months ago move into my house. I won't be doing that again. It has nothing to do with his religion. It just has to do with him not listening after 3 weeks and sneaking alcohol into the house, and then having to deal with someone who's drunk and lots of stuff. But I was helping him get off drugs, off fentanyl. He was dying off fentanyl. Like, the point is, I'm a human, you're a human, we're all human. We're just trying to figure out this stuff. And we're all approaching it a little bit differently on what we're accepting as evidence, what we're saying doesn't quite fit enough for us. But there's all sorts of things, like Jonathan said at the bottom, that we're starting with that's leading us to our conclusions. And I agree. It's been a wonderful conversation. Both of you guys were super polite. Our audience was pretty reasonable. I mean, sometimes there's a debate when you look down and it's like, this has nothing to do at all with anything that we talked about in the show. There's a better debate going on in the comment section than what's happening on the channel right now.
Yeah, they didn't
everybody pay attention to them.
Yeah. They didn't call each other names. If you look at the YouTube comment section, it's much more interesting to watch it. How many Muslims were berating it, right?
I have written a load of swear words on my piece of paper, if that makes any.
Yeah, there you go. No, that's funny.
Oh, wow. Well, before we go, everybody, make sure you go and check out a Tippling Philosopher's channel. That is Jonathan MS Pearce's YouTube channel. And, subscribe, hit that bell so you're notified when he drops a new one. Also, we have our friend Caleb's channel, and he's co-hosting on this. And what does the acronym stand for again?
Proselytize or apostatize.
Proselytize or apostatize.
Which is clever, but it's a very long. N.T. Wright even said it was a mouthful, which is true, but...
Is this like a game show?
No,
or
that's a good idea though. We should now that needs to be a game show. Now someone go on GoFundMe and or start up and do that. That needs to be a thing. Now we're planning on having an exorcist come on this month too, so I'm excited for that show because it's Halloween. We wanted to do something more like that, right? So
it's like if Cleopas came up to you and said this, would you believe? What's your answer going to be? What's it going to be?
Is it A? Yeah, that's funny. Well, I'm sure we can make that a game show, Derek, if you want.
You've won an escaped goat.
Hit that bell, everybody. Make sure you guys are subscribed so you get notified. I really enjoyed Caleb coming on. Also, go to the Amazon link. Well, I have the recommended MythVision books down in the description. You can go there. There's a specific link to Caleb's book, and I'm also going to add that to my recommended list here on camera for you guys. So you can go to that recommended. You can find all this material to be sure to get it. Tons of books by Jonathan, and he's got another book that hasn't quite hit Amazon. It's going to hit it soon. Get his books. Check it out. The one we're going through right now is this one here, The Resurrection, and we're still doing a series on that. Also, The Undead by Caleb here, a historical investigation into the most famous miracle in history. And he's taking a deep dive into the resurrection. You can
in hindsight, I should have changed the subtitle. I could have taken out one of the histories. So you don't have to have historical and history twice, but I'll throw that caveat in there before anyone else brings it up. So that's bothered me since then.
Well, everybody go check that out. Here, I'm adding it to my MythVision recommended. So if you guys want to go to the recommended list, you guys can get it there as well. Also, the Patreon. I always mention this for people. I noticed that when I do this, some people actually join it and recognize, oh my gosh, I didn't realize the treasure of scholarship that you have all in my Patreon, early access. You guys can personally ask me questions. You can ask questions of scholars that I will in the future interview, and I will interview them specifically devoting a whole video to your question. I mean, like, my name is Billy Bob, and I'd like to ask Dr. Robert and Price this question. Dr. Bob, I've been reading the gospel, blah, 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 blah. I read your question out. It is from you, and a whole video is devoted to you because you help support me. You can join for as little as $3 a month, and if you want to, you can always do more than that. I highly appreciate everyone who helps support me to keep doing what I'm doing here so we can have these interactions. Now, with that being said, let me do it the right way because this sandwiches us. Thank you, gentlemen. Until next time, Caleb, we got to do this again, man. Seriously, This was fun.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate everyone in the chat.
I've really loved this. Thank you, Derek, for the opportunity. My partner is drinking a glass of wine through the window, so it's definitely time to join in with the blood of some grapes. That's it.
He was trying to make a joke there. And
He was going to
I was
make
like,
a Christian joke, and he's like,
I was going to, but I was like, no, I can't think of
I
any.
can't do it. Caleb's too nice, man.
Yeah, man.
You mean you're going to go drink Dionysus, right?
Yes,
Let's go with that
thank
one.
you. Yeah,
The blood in the body of Dionysus.
Get me some
Okay.
Bacchus. Yeah.
I love you guys. Never forget, we
Oh,
are MythVision.
MythVision.